There is a place in the Pacific Ocean where the water is so blue it almost doesn't look real. A ring of coral islands, so small they barely interrupt the horizon, encircling a lagoon of impossible stillness. From the air, Eniwetok Atoll looks like a necklace dropped carelessly across the surface of the sea, delicate, scattered, almost apologetic in its smallness. You could be forgiven for thinking nothing of consequence could ever happen in such a place. And yet, in the late winter of 1944, thousands of men sailed toward those islands, knowing they might not come back. They sat on the decks of warships and landing craft, watching the horizon for the first sign of coral and palm trees, carrying with them everything a human being carries into battle: fear pressed down beneath discipline, letters folded into pockets, photographs of people they were trying to return to. They didn't know the name of this atoll before the war. Most of them had never heard of it. But the United States military had decided that Eniwetok was necessary, and so here they came, across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, to fight and die for 36 islands that together don't even amount to the size of a modest American county. This is the story of the Battle of Eniwetok. It is a story about strategy, about courage, and about the particular and terrible arithmetic of Pacific Island warfare, where every coconut grove conceals a bunker, where every strip of beach has been pre-sighted by machine guns, where the ground itself seems to resist you. It is a story that history has sometimes permitted to fade, absorbed into the broader sweep of the Pacific Campaign, overshadowed by louder battles with more famous names. But the men who fought here, American Marines and soldiers pressing forward through coral sand, Japanese defenders fighting from fortifications they had been promised were impregnable, those men deserve to have their story told carefully and told in full. So settle in. This is going to be a long journey, and it is worth taking slowly. To understand why Eniwetok mattered, you have to step back from the atoll itself and look at the larger map. By late 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a point of critical momentum. Japan had built for itself an enormous defensive empire across the central and western Pacific, a chain of island bases, airfields, and naval anchorages stretching from the Gilbert Islands in the east all the way to the Marianas and beyond. This was Japan's so-called defensive perimeter, and in Tokyo it was spoken of with absolute confidence. It would hold. It had to hold, because if it didn't, the road to Japan itself would begin to open. America had different ideas. The strategy that emerged from the highest levels of Allied planning was built on a concept of relentless forward pressure, not fighting for every island, not trying to dislodge every garrison, but selecting points of maximum strategic value and striking them with overwhelming force. Island hopping, the press called it. But there was nothing casual about it. Each hop was a carefully calculated blow aimed at the spine of Japan's defensive system. The Marshall Islands sat at the outer edge of that system. Kwajalein, the first major target in the Marshalls, had fallen to American forces in early February of 1944 with a speed that surprised everyone, including the Americans themselves. But Kwajalein was not the end of the story in the Marshalls. It was, in many ways, the beginning of the next question. Because sitting at the northwestern edge of the Marshall Islands chain, roughly 300 kilometers beyond Kwajalein, was Eniwetok. And Eniwetok had something that made American planners covet it with urgency. One of the finest natural anchorages in the entire Pacific, a deep lagoon capable of sheltering a large fleet, surrounded by islands that could host airfields capable of reaching far into the Japanese-controlled Central Pacific. If Eniwetok could be taken, the Americans would possess a base from which the next great series of strikes could be launched. Strikes toward the Marianas, strikes toward the Carolines, strikes that would push the war's geography closer and closer to the Japanese home islands with every passing month. Eniwetok, in other words, was a door, and behind that door was the rest of the war. Japan understood this too. The garrison that waited on Eniwetok's islands was not a token force. Concrete had been poured, guns had been emplaced, tunnels had been dug into the coral. Men had been sent to hold this place and had been told, in the clear and unambiguous language of imperial Japanese military culture, that they would hold it or they would die holding it. There was, in the minds of those defenders, no third option. What followed was one of the sharpest, most concentrated battles of the entire Pacific War. It lasted a matter of days. It cost lives, American and Japanese, at a rate that is difficult to comprehend in such a compressed time frame. And when it was over, when the last resistance on the last island had been silenced, the entire character of the Pacific War had shifted. Japan's second line of defense had been broken, the perimeter had been punctured, and the Americans were already looking toward the next horizon. Over the course of this documentary, we are going to walk through the entire history of the Battle of Eniwetok from the beginning. We will start with the strategic calculations that made this atoll a target, then move to the Japanese preparations, the American intelligence work, the naval bombardments, the landings, the fighting on Engebi and Parry, and the lagoon's smaller islands, and finally, to the aftermath and the long road that stretched beyond this battle toward the eventual end of the war. We will not rush any of it. Every phase will receive the time and care it deserves. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly this kind of storytelling. Long, thorough, human-scale history, built for the hours when you want to let something important wash over you and carry you somewhere else for a while. If this is the kind of history you find yourself coming back to, consider subscribing. Every video here is built to the same standard. Nothing fabricated, nothing rushed, and nothing left out that matters. But for now, let's begin at the only place a story like this can honestly begin. Not with the invasion fleet, not with the bombardment, but with the ocean itself. With a ring of coral barely visible from the surface of the sea, with an atoll that most of the world had never heard of, about to become the site of one of the Pacific War's most intense and consequential battles. Eniwetok was waiting, and the Americans were coming. There is a certain kind of silence that exists only in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far from any shoreline, where the water runs so deep and so blue that it seems less like a surface and more like an absence. In that silence, in the years before the war, few Americans could have pointed to a dot on a map called Eniwetok and explained why it mattered. It sits near the northwestern edge of the Marshall Islands, a loose bracelet of coral and sand wrapped around a lagoon large enough to anchor an entire fleet. The atoll itself is not dramatic by any ordinary measure. No mountains rise from it. No rivers cut through it. The highest point above sea level could be cleared by a modest jump. And yet, by the early months of 1944, Eniwetok had become one of the most consequential patches of ground in the entire Pacific War. A place where the momentum of two great empires would collide, and where the question of who controlled the ocean's vast distances would begin to find its answer. To understand why Eniwetok mattered, you have to understand the ocean itself. The Pacific is not simply large, it is staggering in its scale, a body of water that covers more of the Earth's surface than all the dry land combined. For military planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor, the central question of 1942 and 1943 was not simply how to fight Japan, but how to cross that ocean. Aircraft of the era could not fly unlimited distances. Warships needed fuel and fresh water and munitions. Troops needed bases from which to stage, to rest, to be supplied. Every advance had to be anchored by some piece of ground capable of supporting the next one. The Pacific War was, at its mechanical heart, a war of geometry, a slow, violent calculation about which islands could project American power closer to the Japanese homeland, and which could be bypassed entirely. The strategy that emerged from American planning sessions had a name that captured its logic cleanly: island hopping. Rather than attacking every fortified Japanese position in sequence, American commanders concluded that the wisest course was to seize only those islands that offered genuine strategic value: an airfield, a harbor, a forward base, and leave the rest to wither in isolation, cut off from supplies, irrelevant to the outcome. The architect of this approach in the Central Pacific was Admiral Chester Nimitz, whose command stretched across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Nimitz and his planners looked at the map and traced a line westward toward Japan, identifying the stepping stones that would make the final advance possible. The Marshall Islands appeared on that line early, and within the Marshall Islands, Eniwetok occupied a position that made it, in purely geographic terms, almost impossible to ignore. The Marshall Islands had been in Japanese hands since the First World War, awarded to Japan as a League of Nations mandate after Germany's Pacific colonies were stripped away in defeat. For 2 decades, Japan developed them quietly, building infrastructure, settling civilians, and, in violation of the mandate's explicit terms, constructing military facilities across dozens of atolls. When Japan formally entered the war in December of 1941, the Marshalls transformed overnight from a colonial backwater into the eastern anchor of what Japanese strategists called their defensive perimeter, a great arc of fortified positions stretching from the Kuril Islands in the north down through the Marianas, the Carolines, and the Marshalls in the east. The idea was to create a barrier so deep, so heavily defended, that American forces would exhaust themselves against it and eventually accept a negotiated peace, leaving Japan dominant in East Asia. It was an audacious strategic vision, and for a time it held. Eniwetok sat at the far northwestern edge of the Marshalls, which made it simultaneously the most exposed and the most valuable position in the island group. Its lagoon measured roughly 30 kilometers across, deep enough and sheltered enough to serve as a major anchorage for naval vessels. Any power that controlled Eniwetok controlled a ready-made forward base within striking range of the Mariana Islands, the next great chain in the American advance. From airfields built on Eniwetok's islands, American bombers could reach targets that had previously been far beyond range. From its lagoon, an American fleet could rest, rearm, and sortie westward with far greater efficiency than if it were operating from Pearl Harbor or even the newly captured atolls further east. The atoll was not just a military position, it was a key that could open the next door. The Americans had not always planned to take Eniwetok so soon. The original timetable for the Central Pacific advance had been more cautious, envisioning a series of preliminary operations to secure the eastern and central Marshalls before any attempt on the atoll's northwestern edge. But the early operations at Kwajalein, in late January and early February of 1944, went better than almost anyone had dared predict. American forces, better trained, better supplied, and fighting with lessons learned from earlier costly battles, moved through Kwajalein with a speed and efficiency that astonished even the commanders who had planned the assault. When the dust settled over Kwajalein and American planners surveyed what had been achieved ahead of schedule, the question was immediately asked: Why wait? Why give Japan time to reinforce Eniwetok when the momentum was running so strongly in one direction? The decision to accelerate the assault on Eniwetok was made quickly and with a confidence born of recent success. But confidence and reality are not always the same thing. Japanese forces had been in the marshals for years, and while their communications with the outside world were increasingly strangled by American naval and air power, they were not idle. Intelligence assessments suggested that Eniwetok's garrison was not enormous, but size alone was never the measure of a Pacific Island defense. A relatively small number of determined men in prepared positions on a narrow strip of coral could exact a terrible price from a landing force crossing an open beach. Every American planner who had studied the battles at Tarawa and Machin in November of 1943 knew exactly what that price could look like. Those lessons had been absorbed and applied, but they had not made the business of storm landing a fortified atoll anything other than extraordinarily dangerous work. Japan's broader defensive logic rested on making each island battle so costly that American public opinion would eventually recoil from the bloodshed and demand a negotiated settlement. The Japanese High Command understood that in a sustained industrial war of attrition, Japan could not outproduce the United States. But they believed, with a grim and persistent calculation, that they could outlast American political will if the cost of each successive island was high enough. Eniwetok was meant to be one more brick in that wall of attrition, one more place where American boys would die in sufficient numbers to give politicians in Washington pause. It was a strategy that required Japanese soldiers to die in enormous numbers themselves, and they largely accepted that requirement with a fatalism that their American adversaries found both baffling and deeply unsettling. The Marshall Islands campaign was also being watched closely by Allied commanders and political leaders in London and Washington, who were managing not just the war in the Pacific, but simultaneous campaigns in Europe and North Africa. Resources were never unlimited. Every carrier group, every division of Marines, every cargo ship full of ammunition that flowed toward the Pacific was, in some abstract planning sense, a resource not available elsewhere. The pressure on Pacific commanders to demonstrate results, to justify the allocation, was real and constant. A swift, successful capture of Eniwetok would validate the island-hopping strategy, justify the acceleration of the timetable, and generate the kind of strategic momentum that could be converted into additional resources and political support for the next phase of the advance. Geography also imposed its own imperatives on both sides. For Japan, Eniwetok's position made it a logical waypoint for naval forces attempting to reinforce or counterattack across the Central Pacific. Losing it would not simply cost Japan a defensive position, it would fundamentally alter the geometry of the whole ocean, pushing American striking power another significant step closer to the inner ring of Japanese-held territory that Tokyo considered non-negotiable. The Mariana Islands, which lay to the west, were not merely another chain of atolls. They contained the airfields from which, American planners already knew, the new generation of very long-range bombers then in production could reach the Japanese home islands themselves. Eniwetok was the gate, the Marianas were the highway, and beyond the Marianas lay Japan. For the men who would actually execute the assault, the Marines loading their gear onto transports, the sailors checking their gunnery solutions, the pilots studying aerial photographs of coral beaches, these great strategic considerations existed mostly as background noise. What occupied their attention was more immediate: the depth of the water approaching the beach, the location of the Japanese gun emplacements, the distance from the landing craft to the first line of trees. but the weight of all that strategic context rested on their shoulders nonetheless. Every decision made in Washington and Pearl Harbor, every calculation about timetables and resources and acceptable casualties, ultimately cashed out in what those men would face when the ramps dropped and the Pacific morning rushed in around them. Eniwetok was a small atoll on a vast ocean, and it was about to become the center of everything. When American strategists were still debating the precise shape of their Pacific campaign, a Japanese officer was already digging in. Major Masaji Kitano had been given a mission that on paper sounded straightforward: turn a remote coral atoll into a fortress strong enough to bleed any invasion force before it could gain a foothold. The islands themselves were not much to look at. Flat, narrow strips of land barely rising above the waterline, fringed with coconut palms and coral rubble, baking under equatorial sun. But Kitano understood something that would take the Americans considerable effort to fully appreciate. That terrain which offered little cover to defenders could be turned, through engineering and determination, into something far more dangerous than its modest appearance suggested. He had his orders, he had his men, and he had time. For a while, at least, that combination seemed like enough. Kitano's preparations began in earnest through 1943, a year when Japan still believed its outer defensive ring could be held. Imperial General Headquarters had designated a chain of island positions across the Central Pacific as the barrier that would exhaust American strength before it ever reached the home islands. Eniwetok sat near the western edge of the Marshall Islands chain, which meant it served as both a forward outpost and a staging point for any Japanese operations further east. Losing it would not merely cost territory, it would tear a hole in the defensive logic that Tokyo had built its entire strategic posture upon. Kitano knew the weight of what he was being asked to hold, and he approached the task with the methodical intensity of a man who understood that geography, on its own, would not save him. He would have to reshape it entirely. The construction effort that followed was grueling work under brutal conditions. Labor parties worked through the heat of the day and into the cooler hours of evening, hauling coral stone, mixing concrete, and sinking timbers into ground that was barely above sea level. Concrete bunkers rose across the principal islands, low-profile structures designed to present the smallest possible silhouette to naval gunfire, while offering their occupants protected firing positions that faced the most likely avenues of American approach. These were not hastily thrown up emplacements, but carefully planned fighting positions, angled to allow interlocking fields of fire and connected where possible by covered communication trenches. Each bunker was meant to be a problem that attacking infantry would have to solve under fire, and the positioning of those bunkers was intended to ensure that solving one problem immediately exposed the attacker to fire from another direction. Along the beaches themselves, the engineering effort took on a different character. Kitano's engineers constructed networks of log obstacles and barbed wire in the shallows and at the waterline, designed to channel landing craft into predictable corridors where waiting guns could concentrate their fire. Anti-tank obstacles, angular constructions of timber and steel, were embedded in the sand at points where armored vehicles might attempt to cross from the beach inland. The thinking behind these obstacles was not simply to stop vehicles, but to force them into positions where they became stationary targets, exposed and vulnerable, while the infantry riding alongside them scrambled for whatever minimal cover the flat terrain allowed. Every element of the beach defenses spoke to the same underlying intention: to make the first minutes of any American landing the most costly minutes of the entire battle. Inland from the beaches, the defensive architecture deepened. Artillery and mortar positions were carefully sited, their fields of fire calculated to cover the beaches and the ground immediately behind them. Ammunition stockpiles were dug into the earth wherever possible, protected against the air attacks that Japanese commanders knew would precede any serious amphibious assault. Command posts were reinforced and connected to subordinate positions by telephone lines buried beneath the ground, a precaution against the communication breakdowns that aerial bombardment routinely caused. Medical facilities, such as they were established in protected positions away from the primary fighting zones. Kitano was building not just a series of fortifications, but a system, layered, interconnected, and designed to keep functioning even after the outer defenses had been struck hard. The question of manpower was never far from Kitano's calculations. A fortress without enough defenders to man its walls is simply an elaborate target, and through 1943, the garrison strength at Eniwetok remained below what Kitano believed the position required. Requests went up the chain of command with the regularity of a man who understood how thin his margins were. Japanese naval and army logistics were already straining under the demands of multiple contested fronts. Guadalcanal had consumed resources in quantities that shocked planners. New Guinea continued to drain strength, and the broader pressure of American industrial output was beginning to make itself felt in ways that could no longer be explained away. Still, reinforcements did arrive, filtered through the logistical pipeline in increments that fell short of what the defense plan envisioned, but were better than nothing. Additional infantry companies, engineering detachments, and heavy weapons crews made the crossing and took up their assigned positions across the atoll's principal islands. By early 1944, the garrison numbered in the several thousands, spread across Engebi in the north, Parry Island near the atoll's southern end, and a scattering of smaller positions between them. The distribution of forces was not uniform. Parry, which Kitano had identified as the most strategically significant island and the most defensible position in the atoll, received the heaviest concentration of troops and the most elaborate fortifications. This was where the command infrastructure was centered, where the heaviest weapons were emplaced, and where the garrison would make its most determined stand if the outer positions fell. Engebi, with its airfield, was also heavily garrisoned, since control of that airstrip represented a prize the Americans would not ignore. The smaller islands in between were held more lightly, with detachments sufficient to delay and harass rather than to halt a serious assault. The psychological dimension of what Kitano was building deserves careful consideration. Japanese military doctrine in this period did not simply expect its soldiers to fight, it expected them to die in place rather than yield ground. The entire concept of the defensive fortification at Eniwetok, and in fact across Japan's island perimeter, rested on the assumption that the garrison would resist to its last man, extracting the maximum possible cost from the attacker before being destroyed. This was not a posture adopted reluctantly under the pressure of hopeless circumstances. It was the stated doctrine, taught in training, reinforced by the military culture of the period, and embodied in the orders that Kitano had received and passed down to his officers. The concrete and the timber and the steel wire were physical expressions of an institutional will to hold, regardless of what came. There was also, running through the garrison's preparations, a thread of genuine confidence, at least in the early months. Tokyo's assessment, relayed through the military command structure, held that American amphibious capabilities had their limits, and that a sufficiently fortified island position, properly manned and stocked with supplies, could defeat an assault, or at minimum inflict casualties heavy enough to make the Americans hesitate before attempting the next objective. The fall of Tarawa in November of 1943 had shaken that confidence somewhat, because the Americans had absorbed extraordinary losses there and kept going. But the official line, and to a meaningful degree the genuine belief of officers like Kitano, was that better preparation and stronger fortifications would change the arithmetic. A better prepared Eniwetok, the thinking went, would be different. Supply became a growing preoccupation as the months passed and American naval activity in the region intensified. The lines of communication between the Marshall Islands and the Japanese home islands and the main supply bases at Truk were increasingly contested by American submarines and aircraft. Deliveries of food, fuel, ammunition, and construction materials grew less reliable through the second half of 1943. Kitano's engineers, adapted by working with what they had, prioritizing the most critical defensive works and accepting shortfalls in other areas. There was a triage of effort happening beneath the official optimism, a quiet acknowledgement in the decisions being made on the ground that the garrison would need to fight with what it had accumulated, because getting significantly more of anything was no longer something that could be counted upon. The coral itself became a construction material of last resort and first necessity. Where poured concrete was unavailable or had to be rationed, coral blocks were cut, shaped, and stacked to reinforce fighting positions and thicken the walls of bunkers. Palm logs were laid as overhead cover against fragments and light bombs. Sandbags went over whatever structures had enough of them to spare. The result was a defensive landscape that was simultaneously impressive in its ambition and improvised in its execution, the visible product of determined men working against a logistics system that was slowly beginning to fail them. Viewed from a distance, the fortifications of Eniwetok looked formidable. They were formidable in important respects, but they had been built on a foundation of insufficient supply, uncertain reinforcement, and a strategic situation that was moving against Japan faster than Tokyo's official communications acknowledged. When the last months of the garrison's preparation wound down, and early 1944 brought with it the unmistakable signs of an impending American move, Kitano and his men settled into their positions. The bunkers were as complete as they were going to be. The wire was laid, the guns were sighted, the ammunition had been distributed to the fighting positions, and the orders had been given. Whatever was coming would meet a garrison that had done everything within its means to be ready. The Americans would have their air power, their naval gunfire, and their numbers. Kitano had coral and concrete, and the absolute determination of men who had been taught that retreat was not a category that applied to them. Whether that would be enough was a question that only the assault itself would answer, and the assault was now very close. Before a single Marine could step onto a beach, before a single shell could be aimed at a bunker, someone had to know exactly where those bunkers were. In the vast emptiness of the Central Pacific, where atolls sat like scattered coins across an ocean the size of nothing most men had ever imagined, knowledge was not merely useful. It was the difference between a landing force walking into a slaughter and a landing force walking into a manageable fight. The Pacific War had already taught American commanders some of the cruelest lessons imaginable about the cost of underestimating Japanese defensive preparation. Tarawa, just 3 months before Eniwetok, had been a shock of blood and compressed horror that echoed through every planning room in the Pacific. More than 1,000 American dead on a sliver of coral in 76 hours. That price had been paid, in part, by incomplete intelligence. No one intended to pay it again. The intelligence effort aimed at Eniwetok began long before most of the men who would eventually land there had even been assigned to the operation. American strategists understood that the Marshall Islands as a whole represented a layered problem. Dozens of atolls, each with its own configuration of islands, reefs, and potential defensive positions, spread across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of open ocean. The Japanese had controlled this territory since the First World War, operating under a League of Nations mandate, and they had done so with deliberate secrecy. Foreigners were not welcomed. Civilian vessels were discouraged from approaching. For years, the Marshall Islands had existed behind a curtain, and American planners had to tear that curtain down using whatever tools were available to them. The first significant layer of intelligence came from sources that predated the war entirely. Older nautical charts, merchant shipping records, the accounts of missionaries and traders who had visited the islands in earlier decades. All of it was pulled from archives, cross-referenced, and examined for anything useful. Pre-war aerial photography, conducted during the years when tensions were rising but open conflict had not yet begun, provided partial pictures of atoll geography. These older sources could establish the basic shape of things, the position of islands within a lagoon, the rough depth of channels, the locations of landing areas. What they could not do was tell planners how many men were now living behind those beaches, or how deep the concrete went beneath the coral sand. Submarine reconnaissance became one of the most valuable tools available to American intelligence officers working on the Eniwetok problem. American submarines were operating throughout the Central Pacific with increasing confidence by the end of 1943, and they were capable of far more than simply sinking enemy ships. Submarines could approach an atoll quietly, rising to periscope depth to photograph shorelines, observe traffic patterns, and chart the movement of Japanese supply vessels. They could count the ships riding at anchor in a lagoon and make educated assessments about what those ships were delivering and to whom. The information gathered this way was fragmentary and always carried risk. A submarine at periscope depth was a vulnerable thing, but it added layers of detail that no other platform could provide from such close range. Carrier-based and land-based reconnaissance aircraft extended the intelligence picture from above. As American air power in the Central Pacific grew through late 1943 and into 1944, the ability to conduct photographic reconnaissance missions over targets like Eniwetok became more feasible, though never without danger. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries and fighter patrols made low-altitude photography an intensely risky business, and a reconnaissance aircraft that drew too much attention risked alerting the garrison to American interest in the atoll. The balance between gathering information and maintaining the element of surprise required careful judgment. Missions were planned to look, wherever possible, like routine patrols or casual sweeps rather than the deliberate targeting exercises they actually were. Photographic interpretation was itself a specialized skill, and the Americans had invested heavily in developing it. The photographs that came back from reconnaissance flights were not simply handed to a general and glanced at over a map table. They were examined by trained analysts who understood how to read the shadows that revealed the height of a structure, how to identify the distinctive profile of a gun emplacement, how to distinguish a freshly dug fighting position from a natural feature of the landscape. Over time, as multiple flights over the same area were compared and layered, a picture emerged. Imperfect, always incomplete, but far more detailed than anything the Japanese expected their enemy to possess. Analysts could estimate the dimensions of defensive works, identify the locations of probable ammunition stores, and track the growth of fortifications over successive weeks. Signals intelligence added another dimension to what American commanders were assembling. Japanese radio traffic, even when it could not be fully decoded, carried patterns that were informative in themselves. The volume of transmissions, their frequency, the apparent urgency in the rhythm of communication between Eniwetok and higher Japanese commands, all of it helped paint a picture of a garrison that was aware of its potential vulnerability and was working urgently to address it. American signals analysts could not read every message, but they could hear the anxiety in the noise, and that anxiety pointed toward a force that was receiving reinforcement and expecting trouble. The question was precisely how much reinforcement and precisely where those additional men and weapons were being positioned. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations from earlier operations in the Marshall Islands contributed pieces of the puzzle that no aerial photograph could provide. When American forces had seized other atolls in the weeks leading up to the Eniwetok operation, the intelligence teams that followed the assault troops had specific priorities. They gathered maps, they collected orders, they interviewed the handful of prisoners who were taken alive, using every available technique to extract information about Japanese dispositions across the broader island chain. A garrison map captured on one atoll might contain notations about troop allocations on another. A prisoner who had been stationed elsewhere in the Marshalls might know something about the unit that had been sent to reinforce Eniwetok. Every fragment was collected, evaluated, and fitted into the growing mosaic. What that mosaic eventually revealed was both reassuring and sobering in roughly equal measure. Reassuring because the garrison at Eniwetok was not the enormous force that the most pessimistic estimates had feared. Sobering because the defenses that had been constructed were serious, professionally designed, and oriented with a clear understanding of where American forces would most likely attempt to land. The Japanese defenders had not simply scattered their men across the atoll and hoped for the best. They had thought carefully about fields of fire, about the relationship between beach obstacles and covered positions further inland, about how to make an attacker pay the maximum possible price for every meter of ground. The intelligence picture showed a garrison that was smaller than some had feared, but considerably better prepared than a casual assessment might have suggested. The specific character of the terrain at Eniwetok added complications that went beyond the purely military. The atoll consisted of numerous separate islands, arranged around a central lagoon, and each island presented its own distinct intelligence problem. What was true of the approaches to Engebi in the north was not necessarily true of Parry Island in the south. Each island required its own detailed study: the slope of the beach, the depth of the reef approaches, the likely positions of machine gun nests relative to the natural cover available. American planners could not treat Eniwetok as a single target. They had to treat it as a series of separate targets, each with its own tactical requirements and its own intelligence demands. This level of granularity was exactly what the reconnaissance effort was designed to provide. By the time American commanders were finalizing their operational plans, they possessed an intelligence picture that was remarkable by the standards of any previous Pacific operation. It was not complete, no intelligence picture ever is, and there would be surprises when the fighting began. There always were, but the broad outlines of Japanese strength, the general positions of the major defensive works, the likely axes of resistance on each island, all of this was known with a degree of confidence that allowed for genuine planning rather than improvisation. Tactical decisions about where to land, which beaches were most viable, how much preliminary bombardment would be needed, and where to concentrate it. All of these flowed directly from what the intelligence effort had produced. The men who would eventually cross those beaches in landing craft would do so carrying something more valuable than additional ammunition. They would carry the product of months of patient, dangerous, painstaking work by analysts and aviators and submariners who would never fire a shot in anger at Eniwetok, but whose contribution to whatever success followed would be as real as any Marines. That contribution was hard to see from a beach. It left no monument and no grave. The reconnaissance pilot who had photographed a bunker complex from low altitude, fighting his aircraft through anti-aircraft bursts, would never know which specific piece of his film had saved which specific life on the day of the assault. The signals analyst who had noted an unusual spike in Japanese radio traffic and flagged it for his superiors would not be cited in any after-action report for the lives his observation may have preserved. Intelligence was work that dissolved into outcome, leaving behind only the thing it had made possible. And what it made possible, in the case of Eniwetok, was an invasion plan built on something firmer than hope, built on knowledge, imperfect and incomplete as all knowledge in war must be, but real enough to matter when the landing craft pointed their bows toward the coral and the men inside them prepared for what was waiting on the other side of the beach. By the early weeks of 1944, the United States Navy had assembled a force of such concentrated power that it fundamentally changed what war at sea could mean. At the center of that force stood one man, quiet, methodical, and utterly relentless. Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance was not the kind of commander who sought the spotlight. He did not write speeches for the press or cultivate a heroic image for the newsreels. He was, by almost every account of those who served near him, a thinker, a man who processed information with the cold patience of someone who understood that war was ultimately a problem of logistics, timing, and nerve. When he received his orders to lead the Central Pacific Force against the Marshall Islands, he did not celebrate, he planned. And the plan he built was one of the most precisely engineered offensive operations the Pacific had yet seen. Spruance had already proven himself at Midway in the summer of 1942, where he commanded with a restraint that many admirals might have abandoned under pressure. There, he had chosen not to chase a retreating Japanese force into the dark when the risk of torpedo attack outweighed the potential gain. Some called it caution, others called it genius. The distinction barely mattered. What mattered was that the Japanese fleet had been broken, and Spruance had done it without losing his own ships to recklessness. That quality, that precise willingness to hold back when holding back was the correct choice, made him exactly the right man for what the Pacific War demanded in 1944. The campaign ahead was not simply about courage. It was about sequencing, about hitting the right targets in the right order, with the right weight of fire at the right moment. The force Spruance commanded was built around something entirely new in the history of naval warfare: the Fast Carrier Task Force. Designated Task Force 58 and placed under the direct tactical command of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, it represented the fullest expression of American industrial power and naval ambition. Mitcher was a carrier man through and through, a leathery figure who wore a long-brimmed baseball cap against the Pacific sun and understood the rhythms of carrier aviation the way a musician understands tempo. Under his command, Task Force 58 comprised multiple carrier groups, each built around fleet carriers and light carriers surrounded by a protective screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Together, they could put hundreds of aircraft into the sky at once, a mobile airfield that could appear anywhere across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. The aircraft themselves were central to everything. By 1944, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat had replaced the earlier Wildcat as the Navy's primary carrier fighter, and the change was decisive. Where the Wildcat had struggled against the Japanese Zero in the war's opening months, the Hellcat matched it and frequently surpassed it, faster in a dive, better armored, and capable of absorbing damage that would have shredded its predecessor. Alongside the fighters flew Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, each capable of delivering devastating payloads against shipping, airfields, and shore installations. Together, this air fleet gave Spruance a tool of remarkable flexibility, able to strike at distance, suppress enemy air power, interdict supply lines, and directly support ground troops, all within the same coordinated operation. The strategic purpose behind what would become known as Operation Hailstone was both simpler and more ambitious than it might first appear. Truk Lagoon, roughly 1,300 kilometers southwest of Eniwetok, was the great Japanese naval base in the Central Pacific, the headquarters of the combined fleet, a fortress harbor surrounded by a ring of volcanic islands that Tokyo regarded as virtually impregnable. American planners had long eyed Truk as a potential target, but direct assault was considered too costly. Instead, Spruance's task force would strike Truk not to capture it, but to neutralize it, to destroy the aircraft, the warships, the fuel dumps, and the supply ships that made it function as a hub of Japanese power. In doing so, the Americans would cut the supply arteries feeding Japanese positions across the Marshalls, including Eniwetok itself, leaving the garrison there isolated and unsupported at the moment they most needed help. This dual purpose, striking Truk while simultaneously enabling the Eniwetok assault, required a coordination of moving parts that was formidable in its complexity. Spruance's fleet would not simply steam toward the target and begin shooting. The operation was timed to unfold in precise sequence, with carrier strikes serving as the opening act before ground forces ever touched a beach. The airstrikes had to suppress Japanese air power before that air power could threaten the vulnerable transport ships carrying Marines and soldiers toward the atoll. The naval gunfire had to break down coastal defenses and destroy artillery emplacements before assault craft reached the shoreline, and the amphibious force itself, a separate command entirely, had to be positioned, briefed, supplied, and launched with a precision that left almost no margin for error. The amphibious component of the operation fell under the tactical group responsible for the seizure of Eniwetok itself, working beneath the broader umbrella of Spruance's Central Pacific Force. The ground forces assigned to the assault included the 22nd Regiment of the 4th Marine Division, alongside elements of the Army's 106th Infantry. These were not inexperienced men, but neither were many of them veterans of the kind of close-quarters atoll fighting they were about to face. The Marines had trained extensively in amphibious doctrine, but doctrine had a way of dissolving on contact with real sand, real bullets, and real Japanese defenders who had spent months preparing the ground. The planners knew this. They compensated with overwhelming firepower, trusting that sufficient bombardment could break the physical infrastructure of the defense, even when it could not fully break the will of the men behind it. One of the genuine problems facing Spruance and his planners was the question of intelligence, what they knew, what they thought they knew, and what they had no way of knowing. Reconnaissance had been thorough by the standards of the time, but Eniwetok was remote. Japanese camouflage was skilled, and the exact location of every bunker, every gun emplacement, and every underground position was impossible to confirm from aerial photographs alone. The planners worked with their best available estimates, adjusting bombardment schedules to focus heaviest fire on areas where fortifications appeared densest. It was, of necessity, an imperfect science. The guns and aircraft would hit what they could see. What they could not see would wait in the coral and the dark until the first Marines crossed the beach. The logistical scale of the entire endeavor was almost beyond easy comprehension. The fleet required enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts simply to function from day to day. Fleet train vessels, oilers, ammunition ships, repair tenders, followed in the wake of the combat forces, conducting at-sea replenishment so that Spruance's carriers and battleships could operate continuously without returning to port. This was itself a relatively recent development in American naval practice, and it gave the Central Pacific Force an endurance that Japanese planners found difficult to account for. The Americans could sustain their presence over the target area for days and weeks in a way that earlier naval technology simply did not allow. The enemy could not simply wait out the storm and expect it to pass. The relationship between Spruance, Mitchell, and the ground force commanders demanded careful management of authority and ego. Spruance held overall command, but he was a surface warfare officer operating in a world increasingly dominated by aviation. He trusted Mitchell to run the carrier operations and largely left the details of aircraft deployment to the admiral who understood them best. This division of responsibility, strategic authority held at the top, tactical execution delegated downward, reflected a maturity in American command culture that had not always been present in the earlier months of the war. Disagreements happened, tensions existed, but they were resolved, mostly, through the shared recognition that the objective mattered more than personal authority. As the fleet assembled and the final operational orders circulated through the commands, something was in motion that the Japanese had not yet fully reckoned with. The raid on Truk and the assault on Eniwetok were not isolated actions. They were part of a continuous compression, a sustained American pressure that offered Tokyo no clean moment to recover, regroup, and rebuild. Each operation flowed into the next. Each captured island brought the next target within range, and each shattered Japanese air group reduced the ability to contest what came after. Spruance understood this rhythm intuitively, and he had built his fleet to exploit it without pause. Out in the vast blue emptiness of the Central Pacific, the ships were already moving, carriers and battleships, destroyers cutting white lines through the water, transports heavy with men and equipment, all of it converging on a chain of low coral islands that most of those men could not have found on a map 3 months earlier. What came next would test the plan in the only way a battle plan can truly be tested, against the resistance of an enemy who had every reason to fight and every intention of doing exactly that. Before the first Marines set foot on any beach, before any landing craft cut through the lagoon waters, the sky above Eniwetok had to be taken. That was the logic of modern amphibious warfare as the Americans had come to understand it in the brutal schoolroom of the Pacific, that no body of men could survive a contested beach unless the air above them belonged to their side first. Operation Hailstone was the mechanism designed to achieve exactly that. It was not a single strike or a swift raid. It was a sustained, rolling campaign of destruction intended to strip the atoll of its capacity to resist, to silence its guns, scatter its aircraft, and leave its garrison staring upward at empty skies with nothing to send back. When the first wave of American carrier aircraft turned their noses toward the Marshall Islands in the closing days of January 1944, they carried with them the weight of everything that was supposed to come after. The task force that launched these strikes was unlike anything the Pacific had seen at the start of the war. In the desperate months of 1941 and early 1942, America had scraped together what it could and prayed it would hold. Now, more than 2 years on, the industrial weight of the United States had transformed the equation entirely. Carrier decks bristled with aircraft, magazines were full, pilots had been trained in numbers that the Japanese, bleeding their best aviators across 2 years of grinding attrition, could no longer match. The fast carrier task force that moved into range of Eniwetok and the broader Marshall Islands chain represented a new kind of American power, coordinated, confident, and vast. Against what the Japanese garrison had been able to accumulate on those low coral islands, the disparity was already telling. The first strikes went in during the final days of January. Hellcats led the way, their role not to destroy targets on the ground, but to clear the air above them first. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled from the airfields below, rising to meet the threat as they had been trained to do, as duty and honor demanded they do. But the Grumman F-6F Hellcat had been designed with painful precision to defeat exactly the aircraft the Japanese were flying. It was faster, it was tougher, it climbed hard and turned well, and its pilots had been briefed exhaustively on the tactics that had cost so many American lives in the early war. The engagements that erupted above the atolls were sharp and decisive. Not every American pilot came home. The sky over a defended position is never a safe place, and Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on the ground were capable, well-positioned, and not yet broken. But the Japanese fighter strength above the Marshall Islands, already thinned by the relentless tempo of the wider Pacific campaign, could not sustain the contest. Once the air umbrella had been torn away, the work of systematic destruction could begin in earnest. Attack aircraft came in against the airfields, the runways, the revetments, the fuel dumps, the parked aircraft that had not made it into the air. Bombs cratered the coral surfaces that Japanese labor parties had spent months preparing. Warehouses holding ammunition, food, and medical supplies were struck and left burning. Ships that had been sheltering in the lagoon or at anchor near the islands found themselves under assault from aircraft that came in fast and low, skimming the water, releasing their ordnance and pulling away before the gunners below could fully track them. Several vessels were damaged. Others were sunk outright. The supplies they carried, already dwindling as American submarine pressure on Japanese resupply routes bit harder each month, went to the bottom with them. The anti-aircraft fire that rose to meet the American aircraft was intense and genuinely dangerous. The Japanese garrison had positioned their guns with care, clustering them to create overlapping fields of fire that could fill an approach corridor with steel. Pilots flying straight and level to line up a bomb run flew through curtains of black bursts that appeared without warning and could shred an aircraft in an instant. Several American planes took hits over the atoll. Some made it back to their carriers trailing smoke and oil, their pilots nursing damaged machines across miles of open ocean with nothing below but water. Others did not return at all. The men who flew these missions understood, with the particular clarity that combat imposes, that the anti-aircraft fire below them was not symbolic. It was lethal, and it was trying to kill them specifically. They flew their runs anyway, because the mission required it, because the men who would eventually walk those beaches required it. What the Americans were doing was not simply military destruction. It was psychological warfare conducted at altitude. For the Japanese soldiers and sailors below, the experience of sustained aerial bombardment reshapes a man's relationship with time and safety. There is nowhere to go. The noise is unrelenting. The explosions arrive without pattern that the mind can master. Men who had spent months building defenses, who had mixed concrete and hauled steel, and sweated through tropical nights preparing the ground they stood on, now watched it being unmade from above. Reports from Japanese commanders in the Marshall Islands during this period speak of enormous strain on morale, of men who performed their duties but who did so with the growing understanding that the forces arrayed against them could not be answered in kind. The fighters were gone or going. The resupply ships were at the bottom. The radios that might bring word of relief from the home islands brought only silence or worse. The strikes were not conducted blindly. American intelligence, as described in the chapters preceding this one, had produced a reasonably detailed picture of what existed on these islands and where it sat. Targeting was methodical. Gun emplacements that had been photographed by reconnaissance aircraft became coordinates on a map, and attack aircraft followed those coordinates with as much precision as the technology of 1944 allowed. Not every strike landed where it was intended. Bombs fall through wind and human error and the chaos of a defended approach. Some positions survived the bombardment largely intact and would make themselves known only when Marines arrived to take them by hand. But the aggregate effect of repeated strikes over days was cumulative in ways that no single sortie could achieve. Positions that had been missed were hit again. Structures that had survived the first wave had their luck tested by the second and the third. Carrier operations at this scale required a form of choreography that was relentless in its demands on every man involved. Below decks, ordnance crews worked in confined spaces under noise and vibration, moving bombs and fuel with the efficiency of long practice. On the flight decks, aircraft were spotted, fueled, armed, launched, and recovered in cycles that allowed the carriers to maintain near-continuous pressure on the targets. Pilots who landed after a strike ate quickly, were briefed on the next mission, climbed back into their cockpits, and went again. The pace was brutal in its own way, different from the brutality waiting on the islands below, but demanding nonetheless. A carrier at war is a machine built from human endurance, and the men who kept it running during hailstone pushed that endurance hard. Japanese torpedo bombers and medium bombers attempted counterstrikes against the American fleet. These were acts of considerable courage by the crews who flew them. Flying against a task force with layered fighter cover and sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses was not a survivable occupation in the way the early months of the war had occasionally permitted. The incoming Japanese aircraft were intercepted well clear of the fleet in most cases, the combat air patrol Hellcats driving them away or shooting them down before they could press home an attack. A few managed to reach the edge of the formation, pressing through the fighter screen and into the wall of anti-aircraft fire that American warships threw up around themselves. The threat they posed was real enough that every ship's crew stood to their guns, watching the sky with focused attention. But the damage they managed to inflict on the task force was limited. They could not turn the arithmetic of the campaign. Day after day the strikes continued. The rhythm became almost industrial. Preparation, launch, transit, attack, recovery, reload, preparation again. On the islands below, the Japanese garrison endured what it could not prevent. Communications between the atoll's various defensive positions became increasingly difficult as the bombardment destroyed infrastructure and forced men underground. The airfields that had existed to defend Eniwetok from exactly this kind of assault were no longer functional in any meaningful sense. The aircraft that had been based there were gone, the runways were cratered, the fuel that had once been stored there was smoke. Whatever the garrison had believed in the months of construction and waiting, the experience of hailstone was teaching a harder lesson about what air power properly applied could do to a fixed defensive position. By the time American ground commanders began the detailed planning for the amphibious landings, hailstone had done a substantial portion of what it was designed to do. Japanese air power over the atoll had been effectively eliminated. The garrison's ability to receive resupply or reinforcement had been further degraded. Morale among the defenders had taken blows that no concrete bunker could fully protect against. None of this made the landing straightforward or safe. The Japanese soldiers who remained were still armed, still determined, still positioned in fortifications that weeks of bombardment had damaged but not destroyed. The bunkers that had been built into the coral and reinforced with whatever materials the garrison could obtain had proven more durable than the airfields and warehouses above ground. The men inside them were still alive and still resolute, shaped by a military culture that regarded surrender as a form of death more complete than death itself. What Hailstone delivered, then, was not a clean solution, but an altered battlefield. The American forces that would follow in the landing craft would arrive on shores that had been struck repeatedly, whose defenders had been denied air cover, whose supply lines had been cut more severely than before. They would arrive on islands where the men waiting for them had lived for days beneath an aerial bombardment that had killed some of them, destroyed much that they depended on, and left the survivors in a state of sustained physical and psychological strain. The Marines and soldiers who would do the landing would still face bunkers, machine guns, mortars, and men who intended to die fighting. But they would face them without the weight of Japanese air power pressing down on them from above. The sky, when the landing craft finally moved, would be American. In the Pacific in 1944, that was worth everything. By late January of 1944, the men stationed on Eniwetok Atoll had begun to feel the shift. The distant thunder of American carrier aircraft was no longer a rumor passed between sentries at night. It was a reality that pressed against the sky each morning with growing certainty. Japanese commanders across the Marshall Islands had watched the outer ring of their defenses crumble with a speed that no strategic assessment had fully prepared them for. Kwajalein had fallen, Roy Namur had fallen. The American war machine was not pausing to consolidate, not giving Tokyo the breathing room its planners had counted on. It was accelerating, and Eniwetok, sitting at the western edge of the Marshalls like a coral gateway, was plainly next in line. The men of the garrison could read the situation in the contrails overhead and in the silence from supply routes that had once hummed with regular traffic. The world beyond the atoll was closing in, and it was closing in fast. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood that losing Eniwetok would not be a matter of local embarrassment. This was a structural wound. The atoll sat at a position that, once in American hands, could support further strikes deep into the Central Pacific, threatening the second line of Japanese defenses before Tokyo had any realistic chance of reinforcing it. Naval planners in Truk and in the home islands looked at their maps and saw what the loss of Eniwetok would mean. A breach in a line they had told themselves was solid. Orders were issued. Reinforcement convoys were discussed, planned, and in some cases dispatched. But the problem with every reinforcement plan was the same brutal arithmetic. American carrier groups now roamed the waters surrounding the Marshalls in a strength that no surface convoy could safely challenge. The sea lanes that Japan needed open were, in practice, already closed. Despite this, the Japanese military did not simply accept the situation and wait. Attempts were made to push fighter sweeps out from island bases within range of Eniwetok, with the intention of challenging American air superiority over the atoll and buying time for the garrison. These missions were not casual gestures. Pilots flew them knowing the odds had shifted, knowing that American combat air patrols were better coordinated, better equipped, and growing more experienced with each passing week. Japanese Zero fighters, which had terrified Allied aviators in the early years of the war, were now meeting Hellcats flown by men who had studied their tactics, trained against their strengths, and developed the doctrine to counter them. The fighter sweeps that Japanese commanders ordered did achieve moments of contact, did force American formations to respond, but they could not sustain the attrition they would have needed to genuinely disrupt American operations. For every engagement that produced a temporary disruption, the broader picture grew darker. Torpedo bomber missions were also attempted, directed at the American naval surface forces gathering in the waters around the Marshalls. These attacks required courage that was difficult to measure, flying slow, heavy aircraft at low altitude against warships that bristled with anti-aircraft guns, guided by radar systems the Japanese could not match. Some of these missions pressed home with genuine determination. Crews who survived the approach found themselves threading through curtains of fire, trying to release their weapons close enough to have any chance of hitting ships that maneuvered aggressively the moment contact was made. The results did not justify the losses. American defensive gunnery, combined with combat air patrols vectored by shipboard radar, made the waters around the task force extraordinarily dangerous for any attacking aircraft. The torpedo attacks imposed anxiety, but not damage of strategic significance. They were brave. They were also insufficient. Inside the atoll, Major Masaji Kitano was working against a clock he could not stop. Every day without a major American landing was a day in which his men could dig another meter of trench, add another layer of coconut log over a bunker roof, or position another weapon to cover a likely landing approach. The work was relentless, driven by the knowledge that the preliminary bombardments had already begun and that each wave of American aircraft was both an immediate threat and a signal of what was coming. Kitano was a professional soldier, not a man given to illusions about his situation, and the evidence available to him pointed in one clear direction. He prepared accordingly, shaping his defenses to extract the maximum possible cost from any landing force, because that was the mission that remained achievable even when survival was not. Reinforcements did reach Eniwetok before the American assault began, though not in the numbers that would have been needed to fundamentally alter the garrison's prospects. Small groups of soldiers arrived by submarine and by fast surface craft that moved at night, hugging whatever cover the darkness and the distances provided. These men brought additional weapons, additional ammunition, and the knowledge that Tokyo had not forgotten the atoll. But they also brought the unwelcome reality of what the supply chain had become: thin, irregular, and deeply unreliable. The reinforcement that Kitano had been promised and the reinforcement that actually arrived were two different things, separated by the dominance of American naval and air power over every route that might have carried more. He incorporated the new arrivals into his defensive scheme and continued his preparations with what he had. The psychological weight on the garrison during this period deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. These were men who had watched the news from across the Marshalls and understood what it meant in concrete terms. They were not isolated from the broader picture in the way that later Pacific garrisons sometimes were, cut off by total communication failure. They knew the outer ring had gone. They knew relief was unlikely to arrive in force. And yet the Japanese military code, the culture of absolute commitment to one's post, the belief that to die in the emperor's service was both duty and honor, these were not abstract principles to the men on Eniwetok. They were the framework through which the garrison understood its situation, and that framework pointed toward one outcome: resistance, to the end. American intelligence was tracking this psychology as much as it was tracking troop numbers and bunker positions. Analysts studying captured documents and debriefing the rare prisoner taken during operations elsewhere in the Marshalls painted a picture of a garrison that would not break under bombardment in the way that the overall casualty calculus of a rational defender might suggest. Japanese soldiers, the intelligence assessments emphasized, were not calculating personal odds and making individual decisions about survival. They were operating within a collective commitment that made the usual assumptions of European-style warfare difficult to apply. This shaped how American commanders thought about the upcoming assault, not simply as a matter of suppressing defenses, but as an operation against men who would continue to fight from positions that appeared destroyed, from tunnels that appeared cleared, from corners of the island that had been declared secure. The Americans tightened their grip on the surrounding waters with a thoroughness that left Japanese surface attempts at reinforcement with almost no viable window. Destroyer patrols swept the approaches. Aircraft flew reconnaissance missions around the clock. Submarines maintained watch on the deeper routes that might have carried larger convoys. The effect was to place Eniwetok in a kind of isolation that its garrison could feel but could not break. Supplies were being consumed. Ammunition stocks, while substantial, were finite. Food and fresh water, always a concern on a low coral atoll with limited natural resources, were being managed against a future that grew shorter with each passing day. The garrison endured, because endurance was what remained. There was a particular cruelty in the timing of the American approach, though cruelty was not its purpose. The reinforcement troops that Japan had managed to send to Eniwetok had only recently arrived and integrated into the defensive structure when the pace of American operations accelerated sharply. The men who had traveled hundreds of nautical miles to strengthen the garrison had barely enough time to learn the ground before the full weight of American attention turned toward the atoll. They had not been stationed there long enough to know the terrain the way the original garrison did, to feel the particular rhythms of the island, to understand instinctively where cover was reliable and where it was not. They fought alongside men who did know these things, and they drew on that knowledge as best they could, but the timing left them at a disadvantage that no amount of personal courage could entirely compensate for. By the final days before the American landing force arrived in the waters near the atoll, the Japanese response had reached its practical limit. Fighter sweeps had been attempted and had cost dearly. Torpedo attacks had been pressed and had failed to shift the naval balance. Reinforcement convoys had delivered a fraction of what was needed. The garrison that waited on Engebi, on Parry, on the smaller islands scattered across the lagoon's rim, was the garrison that would fight. These men had done what they could with what they had, and they had done it under the knowledge that the outcome was almost surely fixed. The question was not whether the atoll would fall. The question, as Japanese commanders and ordinary soldiers alike understood it, was how much the Americans would pay before it did. On that question, the garrison had every intention of providing an answer. In the harbors and anchorages of Hawaii, the machinery of American amphibious warfare began its final assembly. The first weeks of February 1944 saw the convergence of dozens of vessels, transports, destroyers, cruisers, and support ships, gathering at Pearl Harbor and subsidiary bases across the islands. Men of the 22nd Regiment of the 4th Marine Division filed aboard the transports, their equipment packed into holds and secured on decks, their minds occupied by the weight of what lay ahead. The harbor itself had transformed into a floating city of steel, a concentrated display of American industrial capacity marshaled for a single objective. Officers moved between ships, reviewing manifests and ensuring that ammunition, supplies, and personnel were accounted for with mathematical precision. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of Marines, sailors, and soldiers about to be launched across the Pacific toward an atoll few of them had ever heard of, against an enemy they knew primarily through briefings and rumors. Yet the routine of loading and preparation continued with practiced efficiency, each man performing his assigned task, each ship taking its place in the formation that would soon sail westward toward combat. The atmosphere aboard the troop transports carried the peculiar tension of men suspended between safety and danger. Below decks, The Marines occupied cramped quarters, their bunks stacked in tiers that left barely enough space to turn over. The air grew thick and humid, saturated with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and the musty odor of the ship itself. Men cleaned their weapons repeatedly, stripped them down and reassembled them until the motions became automatic, a way to occupy restless hands and minds. Officers and non-commissioned officers distributed information about their objective, though official details remained sparse and security-conscious. What the men knew came largely through maps posted in ready rooms, topographical outlines of an atoll called Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands, coordinates and distances that transformed an abstract location into something increasingly real. Rumors circulated below deck as they always did, whispered conversations about Japanese defenses, about the ferocity of island garrisons, about men who had not come back from earlier operations in the Pacific. Some Marines read letters from home, others played cards or wrote their own correspondence, seeking words that might bridge the growing distance between the fleet and the world they had left behind. The ship's constant vibration and the monotonous sound of the engines created a background hum to everything, a reminder that they were constantly moving, always drawing closer to the unknown. The intelligence briefings conducted aboard the transports carried a weight that no routine training exercise could replicate. Officers gathered the men in compartments and open spaces, sometimes on deck where the Pacific wind provided some relief from the heat below, to explain what reconnaissance had revealed about Eniwetok. Maps were spread across tables or projected onto surfaces improvised for the purpose, showing the atoll's horseshoe configuration, the islands that comprised it, and the positions where Japanese defenders had dug in. Intelligence officers, speaking with the authority of those who had studied photographs and analyzed reports, described reinforced concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and the presence of substantial anti-tank and anti-aircraft defenses. They estimated garrison strength, numbers that varied somewhat depending on which officers conducted which briefings, but all suggesting a formidable defense. The men learned that the largest Japanese concentration waited on Parry Island, that preliminary naval bombardment would attempt to soften these positions, and that their own role would be to establish beachheads and expand them methodically against determined resistance. Some officers made no attempt to minimize the danger ahead. Others adopted a more reassuring tone, emphasizing American advantages and the success of similar operations conducted weeks earlier against other Marshall Islands positions. The effect of these briefings was mixed. Some men found clarity and even comfort in understanding their objective and the challenges awaiting them. Others felt the weight of knowledge more heavily than they had felt the weight of uncertainty, knowing now not just that danger lay ahead, but approximately what form that danger would take. The voyage itself lasted several days, and the fleet maintained the security protocols necessary for an operation involving such numbers and such secrecy. Radio silence was enforced, meaning that the ships could not communicate with each other or with bases except through essential signals. The convoy followed a course designed to avoid detection, moving through waters where American naval and air superiority theoretically provided protection, though every man aboard understood that nothing was truly certain in wartime. The days developed a rhythm that was at once monotonous and charged with anticipation. Reveille sounded at dawn, men prepared themselves and their equipment, and the endless routines of military life continued. Physical training occurred in spaces below deck or on whatever portions of the weather deck could be spared. Men stood watch, performed maintenance duties, and attended more briefings as officers refined their understanding of tasks ahead. For officers and senior enlisted men, The voyage included detailed planning sessions where company and platoon commanders reviewed their specific roles in the assault. They studied the terrain revealed by reconnaissance photographs, identified landmarks that would serve as reference points once they landed, and calculated timings and distances that would govern their operations ashore. Maps were marked with unit boundaries, approach routes, and objectives. The precision of military planning became visible in these sessions. Every effort made to reduce chaos and uncertainty, every attempt to impose order on the inherent disorder of combat operations. Among the men, there was an unspoken recognition that this voyage represented a threshold. They had trained for months, some for much longer than that, and all the preparation was being focused now on a specific place and time. The anticipation carried different weights for different men. Some felt the thrill of finally approaching the moment for which they had prepared, the chance to prove themselves in actual combat. Others felt primarily fear, though few would articulate this openly, preferring to mask it with humor or absorbed attention to their duties. The more experienced men, those who had seen action before at Tarawa or Makin or other islands, understood something about what lay ahead that the newcomers could sense but not fully grasp. Their quieter demeanor and occasional comments, delivered without drama or ceremony, provided a shroud of reality behind the official narratives. Letters were written during the voyage, messages home that sometimes contained veiled references to coming operations and sometimes simply spoke of ordinary things, men trying to maintain connections with the world they might not return to. Photographs circulated showing the faces of wives, girlfriends, children, and parents, small reminders of lives continuing in the distant mainland while these men sailed toward violence. Some men found solace in religious practice, attending the services conducted by ship's chaplains. Others sought escape in sleep, in books or magazines, or in the camaraderie of their units. The ocean seemed both protective and isolating, a barrier between the fleet and the outside world, a watery passage between the known and the unknown. The command structure aboard the transports maintained strict discipline and preparation, even as the voyage continued. Officers conducted numerous rehearsals of assault procedures, though the constraints of a moving ship limited how realistic these could be. Men practiced with ropes and nets, simulating the descent from transport to landing craft, movements that had to become automatic to avoid chaos when the actual assault began. Officers reviewed signals and procedures, ensuring that the massive undertaking would function with something approaching coordination. The fleet operated under protocols developed through earlier amphibious campaigns, each element knowing its role in the larger machinery. Communication networks were tested within the constraints of radio silence, allowing officers to verify that their systems functioned and that units could receive and transmit essential information. Supply officers checked manifests repeatedly, verifying that ammunition, medical supplies, rations, and all the material required for combat were properly distributed and accessible. Engineers reviewed the specifications of landing craft, ensuring they would function properly when the actual assault began. Every element of the force conducted rehearsals and reviews, all the while maintaining the psychological readiness necessary for combat. The men could sense this focus and preparation in the officers around them, in the intensity of briefings and drills, in the absence of complacency or carelessness. As the voyage progressed, the fleet began receiving reports from reconnaissance forces already forward. These reports, limited by the demands of operational security, provided some indication of what lay ahead. Air reconnaissance had photographed the islands, revealing concrete fortifications and defensive positions. Earlier reconnaissance missions had gathered information about Japanese strength and disposition. These intelligence updates were processed by commanders and passed down through the ranks in controlled fashion, each additional piece of information refining the picture of what awaited them. The reports confirmed that Eniwetok held a substantial garrison, that the Japanese had invested significant effort in fortification, and that the assault would encounter serious resistance. There was no revelation in these reports. The briefings had already established the likely difficulties, but there was confirmation, a sense that the estimates and plans were based on actual observation rather than assumption. Officers briefed their men on these updates, maintaining morale while being honest about the challenges ahead. Some officers emphasized the lessons of Tarawa, where inadequate preliminary bombardment had resulted in terrible casualties, and assured their men that every effort would be made to reduce the Japanese positions before they had to cross exposed beaches. Others focused on unit cohesion and tactical proficiency, asking their men to trust in training and to trust in each other. The psychological preparation for combat was perhaps the most intangible yet most important aspect of the voyage. Men thought about their own mortality in ways they might not have done during training in safe bases. They contemplated the possibility of wounds and death, not always consciously or continuously, but in moments of solitude below deck or during the long watches of night. Some found that the fear diminished once they ceased trying to ignore it, once they acknowledged the possibility and made their peace with it. Others felt it building, a background anxiety that colored every thought and conversation. Many sought distraction in routine and duty, finding that the small tasks and responsibilities of military life provided sufficient occupation for the mind. Religion became more than a nominal affiliation for some men. Chaplains reported increasing attendance at services as the voyage continued, and the reality of the coming assault became more concrete. The bonds between men in close units seemed to strengthen, not through dramatic moments or articulated oaths, but through the simple fact of facing the unknown together, of being dependent on each other for their survival and success. Officers and senior enlisted men understood this development and sometimes fostered it, recognizing that unit cohesion would be crucial once the shooting began. The fleet's position in the Pacific could be tracked mentally by those who had access to maps and information. They were moving westward, hour after hour, day after day, each watch marking another section of ocean crossed, another increment of distance traveled toward Eniwetok. The Marshall Islands lay ahead, still thousands of kilometers away, but growing closer with each passing day. The sea itself seemed to emphasize their journey, nothing but water in every direction, the horizon marked only by the other ships in their convoy, and the empty expanses of the Pacific. Some men had never been to sea before, and the voyage itself was disorienting, the constant motion and the absence of familiar landmarks creating a sense of displacement. Others were hardened sailors or experienced enough in military operations that the voyage seemed like merely the preliminary phase to what mattered, the actual landing and combat ashore. The nights were cooled by the ocean breeze, the days grew warmer as they progressed westward, and the sun climbed higher. Weather sometimes provided relief from the heat, bringing rain squalls that swept across the fleet and reminded the men that they were crossing waters that could be dangerous in their own right, apart from human conflict. The final days of the voyage saw intensified preparations as the fleet drew near its objective. Ammunition was checked and rechecked, supplies were organized for rapid distribution, and final briefings took place with a specificity that had been lacking in earlier discussions. Maps were now specific about the exact locations where units would land, the sequence in which waves of landing craft would strike the beaches, and the objectives to be seized in the first crucial hours. Officers walked their men through scenarios, describing how the assault would unfold, reminding them of their specific responsibilities and asking them to focus on executing their tasks well. The sense of imminence became palpable in the hours before the fleet reached its launching point. Sleep was difficult for many, though men who had learned to sleep through discomfort managed it regardless. Letters were completed and sealed, sometimes with the knowledge that these might be the last words sent home. Religious men attended final services. Others simply prepared themselves mentally, reviewing their tasks, thinking about their units, accepting the proximity of combat as a fact that could no longer be denied or delayed. The assembly of the invasion fleet represented the culmination of months of preparation and logistics. The ships carrying the Marines and soldiers represented perhaps the most direct expression of American military power. The ability to assemble thousands of men, massive quantities of equipment and supplies, and specialized vessels and personnel, all coordinated toward a single objective across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The voyage itself, though characterized by confinement and tedium, had moved the fleet into position for an assault that would break Japan's second defensive line in the Pacific. The men aboard the transports had been transformed by the voyage from soldiers in training to soldiers preparing for combat, their knowledge refined, their focus sharpened by the accumulation of days spent thinking about what lay ahead. They approached Eniwetok, knowing what intelligence could tell them about their objective, understanding in broad terms what they would face, and carrying with them the weight of expectations and fears that precede combat. The fleet itself, anchored now in final assembly, represented an enormous concentration of power and purpose. Ships and men coordinated for a single operation that would determine whether American strategy in the Pacific would continue to advance or would be checked by Japanese defenses. In the morning, the assault would begin, transforming these final preparations into the reality of combat on unfamiliar islands under fire from an enemy determined to prevent the American advance toward Japan itself. The morning of the 19th of February 1944 arrived with the peculiar stillness that precedes violence. Men packed into landing craft that bobbed like wooden teeth across the dark Pacific, their stomachs tight, their rifles held vertically between their knees. The island they were about to assault, Engebi, sat at the northern tip of the Eniwetok Atoll, a low, palm-studded strip of coral and sand that from a distance appeared almost peaceful. But the men who studied the reconnaissance photographs knew better. Engebi was defended, fortified, and occupied by Japanese soldiers who had spent months preparing to kill them. The American commanders had chosen Engebi as the first target, not by chance but by design. Seize the northern island, establish a beachhead, build an airfield, and use it as a springboard for the assault on Parry Island to the south. The 22nd Regiment of the 4th Marine Division would lead the way, supported by naval gunfire that had been falling on the island since dawn. As the landing craft pushed forward through the shallow lagoon waters, the Marines could see the results of the bombardment. Smoke rising from the interior, palms snapped at their trunks, craters scarring the beach. Yet Japanese soldiers remained. They always remained. The naval gunfire had been intense and unrelenting. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had poured shells into Engebi through the pre-dawn darkness and into the morning hours. Their guns aimed at positions identified by reconnaissance photographs and the observations of spotters positioned on nearby vessels. The island, roughly 3 miles long and half a mile wide at its broadest point, had been hammered systematically. Yet the Japanese had learned through bitter experience how to survive such bombardments. Their bunkers were dug deep into the coral, reinforced with concrete and coconut logs, designed not to withstand direct hits, but to shelter men in the intervals between explosions. Their gun emplacements were scattered, connected by communication trenches, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the beach, where American soldiers would inevitably come ashore. Major Masaji Kitano had overseen much of this preparation himself, though he was not present on Engebi this morning. He commanded the overall garrison from Parry Island to the south. The men defending Engebi that day numbered roughly 1,200, a mix of combat troops, naval personnel, and labor battalions pressed into service as infantry. They huddled in their bunkers and waited, listening to the thunder of American guns, knowing that when the shelling stopped, the real battle would begin. The landing craft reached the beach at approximately 0900 hours. The ramps went down, and men poured out into waist-deep water, their packs heavy, their weapons held high to keep them dry. This was the moment when every theory, every plan, every preparation encountered the brutal reality of combat. Japanese machine guns, which had survived the bombardment by being concealed in coconut groves and behind coral ridges, opened fire. The sound was not like anything the men could prepare for, a stuttering roar, punctuated by the wet snap of rounds striking flesh and bone. Men fell into the shallow water, their bodies floating face down, their blood mixing with the turquoise lagoon. Others pressed forward, shouting, splashing through the water with survival instinct driving them more than courage. American artillery and naval gunfire roared back over their heads, targeting the flashes of Japanese muzzles, trying to suppress the fire enough for the men to reach the beach. A few made it across the open water to the sand, where they threw themselves behind whatever obstacles they could find. The scattered remnants of Japanese construction materials, bomb craters, piles of coconut logs. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, the kind of sound that obliterates thought and leaves only reaction. Officers and sergeants moved among their men, shouting orders that few could hear, gesturing forward, organizing teams to suppress the Japanese positions. This was not a coordinated assault so much as a controlled chaos. Thousands of individual decisions compressed into seconds by men fighting for their lives. The Japanese had prepared several layers of defense, and American forces encountered them in sequence as they pushed inland from the beach. The first line consisted of machine gun nests and rifle pits dug into the sandy soil and coral, positioned to rake the beach with fire. These positions were deadly but also vulnerable, exposed to American counterfire and subject to neutralization by grenades and rifle fire from concentrated assault teams. American flamethrower teams, men burdened with enormous tanks of burning liquid strapped to their backs, moved forward with their weapons extended before them like threatening insects. When they ignited, the flamethrowers threw streams of fire 20 to 30 feet across the ground, coating Japanese positions in a wall of flame that consumed everything: vegetation, fortifications, and the men behind them. Few things broke the resolve of defenders, like the appearance of flamethrowers. The weapon was terrifying, not just for its destructive power, but for what it represented about the nature of the warfare being waged. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial bombardment and the beach crossing faced a choice between surrender, which their military code forbade, or death. Most chose according to the code instilled in them through years of military training and the pressure of their comrades around them. By mid-afternoon, the Marines had secured most of the northern end of Engebi Island, pushing inland from the beaches through coconut groves and past scattered Japanese positions. The resistance, while fierce in places, was not coordinated as it might have been if Major Kitano had been present to direct operations. Instead, the Japanese garrison on Engebi fought in pockets, each unit or position acting with the capability and leadership available to them locally. This fragmentation meant that American forces, working with superior numbers and firepower, could concentrate their strength against weaker points and work their way forward methodically. However, the work was slow and brutal. Every palm tree provided cover for a machine gunner. Every crater became a bunker. Every Japanese soldier seemed determined to extract a price for every yard of ground surrendered. American casualties mounted through the afternoon. Men struck by sniper fire. Men caught in machine gun crossfires. Men killed by grenades thrown from concealment. The medics moved forward through the fighting, treating the wounded where they fell, or carrying them back to impromptu aid stations established behind the lines. The stretcher bearers worked in pairs, carrying injured men through shell-torn ground, dodging enemy fire, moving at a pace that seemed agonizingly slow to anyone watching, but that was actually a full sprint in combat conditions. Night fell on Engebi with the fighting still incomplete. Japanese soldiers, some of whom had been bypassed or isolated by the American advance, remained scattered across the island in small groups. The American forces dug in along a line roughly 2/3 of the way across the island, establishing defensive positions and preparing for the inevitable Japanese counterattack. On the Pacific Islands, night fighting was particularly vicious because both sides understood that darkness could be used by determined men to advance, to infiltrate, to strike from unexpected angles. The Japanese had no intention of yielding Engebi without extracting maximum cost, and night afforded them opportunities that daylight did not. American soldiers lay in their positions with fixed bayonets, listening to sounds in the darkness, the rustle of movement, the whisper of Japanese voices, the occasional challenge and response of their own sentries trying to prevent friendly fire incidents. The flares that American forces fired illuminated the darkness in eerie detail, casting everything in a ghostly white light that was somehow more disorienting than complete darkness. Japanese soldiers emerged from concealment and charged American positions, running or walking forward in groups, shouting commands to each other, their weapons held before them. These charges were not random or irrational, but rather a deliberate tactical choice based on the understanding that the American forces would eventually eliminate them regardless. Better to die fighting than to die hiding in a bunker. American soldiers, firing from prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, cut down these charging groups methodically. The bodies accumulated in the darkness between the lines, and by dawn, the Japanese had ceased their attempts to break through. The fighting on Engebi continued through the 20th of February, though the character had changed. The initial beachhead was secure. American forces controlled most of the island, and what remained was methodical mopping up of isolated positions and the clearing of the remaining defenders. Japanese soldiers in hidden bunkers or underground fortifications could hold out for days or weeks in theory, but the Americans had developed techniques for dealing with these situations. Flamethrowers were deployed against entrances, explosives were placed at bunker openings, artillery shells were called in to collapse fortifications. When surrender was not forthcoming, the answer was destruction. By the afternoon of the 20th, organized Japanese resistance on Engebi had effectively ceased. Small groups of survivors might have remained, hiding in the thick undergrowth or in collapsed bunkers, but their ability to affect the outcome of the campaign had passed. American forces moved through the island in the final hours of the 20th, eliminating resistance pockets, gathering intelligence from captured documents, and beginning the process of converting Engebi into an American military base. The airfield, which had been damaged by bombardment and left incomplete by its Japanese builders, would be restored and expanded to accommodate American fighters. Supply dumps would be established. Personnel would arrive to transform this island from a Japanese fortress into a stepping stone on the American path toward Tokyo. The human cost of Engebi's capture became visible only after the fighting ceased. American casualties totaled roughly 300 men killed or wounded, a significant loss for a unit that was only beginning its campaign in the Marshall Islands. The Japanese garrison had been virtually annihilated. Fewer than 100 soldiers survived as prisoners, and the remainder, numbering well over 1,000, were dead. The beaches were scattered with bodies, both American and Japanese, eventually collected and processed in the grim accounting that followed every battle. The wounded received whatever medical care could be provided in the austere conditions of a forward military base. The dead were wrapped, identified when possible, and prepared for transport back to bases where they could receive proper burial, with the ceremony due to fallen soldiers. Among the living, exhaustion set in rapidly. Men who had fought through the previous day and night, who had crossed beaches under fire and cleared bunkers by hand, collapsed where they stood, sleeping despite the discomfort and the danger. Officers moved among the troops, re-establishing units, identifying casualties, consolidating positions, and preparing for the next phase of the operation. Ammunition was brought forward. Supplies were organized. Damaged equipment was collected and either repaired or removed. The machinery of war, which had been operating at maximum intensity for 2 days, gradually transitioned into a lower gear, still operating, still dangerous, but less frantic than the moment of assault. Engebi Island, now secured, had become the northern anchor of American operations in the Eniwetok Atoll. From this position, further operations against the remaining islands could be launched with closer air support, shorter supply lines, and improved coordination between units. The establishment of an airfield meant that fighters could be based on Engebi itself, providing continuous cover for operations further south against Parry Island and the other islands of the atoll. Engineers and construction battalions moved into Engebi immediately after the fighting ended, beginning the work of expanding and improving the Japanese airfield, constructing storage facilities, and preparing accommodations for the thousands of personnel who would arrive in the following days. The transformation of a Japanese island fortress into an American military base was notably swift. Within 48 hours of the completion of organized fighting, Engebi had already begun its metamorphosis. The Japanese flag that had flown over the island, if any remained intact, had been replaced by the American flag. Japanese installations were being dismantled. American installations were being constructed. The coral and sand that had been consecrated to Japanese imperial defense were now being dedicated to American war production. Yet the island itself bore permanent marks of the violence that had occurred. Craters pockmarked the landscape. Trees were reduced to blackened stumps. Bunkers lay shattered or buried. The destruction was not random but purposeful, the physical manifestation of the methods by which military control was transferred from one nation to another. The significance of Engebi's fall extended far beyond the island itself. For Japan, it represented the breach of what was supposed to be an impregnable defensive perimeter. The Marshall Islands had been garrisoned, fortified, and prepared as a fortress line that would inflict such damage on any American invasion force that further American advances would become impossible. Engebi's capture, followed so swiftly by the capture of Engebi's northern twin Engebi, suggested that this entire strategy was flawed. American firepower, American numbers, and American methods had proven superior to what Japan could muster on a small island. If Japan could not hold Eniwetok, what could it hold? The question that would have faced Japanese commanders in Tokyo was not whether the atoll could be retaken, that was already impossible, but whether the entire defensive strategy of the Pacific War needed to be reconsidered. For American forces, Engebi's capture was a validation of the strategy and methods that were being employed. The island-hopping campaign, supported by massive naval firepower and air superiority, was proving effective. Casualties had been significant, but the objective had been achieved, and the position was being consolidated rapidly. The next objective, Parry Island, was already in preparation, and the men and officers who had fought at Engebi would be among those who would assault it in the coming days. The war would continue, more islands would fall, more lives would be lost, but the trajectory was becoming clear. Japan was losing control of the Pacific, and nothing it did on Eniwetok or the surrounding islands could ultimately reverse that reality. The beach at Engebi was a churning maze of smoke and spent ordnance as the 19th of February gave way to the 20th. American Marines had crashed ashore in waves, overwhelming the initial Japanese defenses through sheer force and speed, but the island was far from secured. Across the northern face of the atoll, pockets of resistance remained, scattered in concrete bunkers and interconnected trenches that the preliminary bombardment had failed to fully destroy. These were not organized defensive lines anymore. They were fragments, remnants of Major Kitano's garrison, clinging to positions with the knowledge that surrender was not an option. For the Japanese soldiers entrenched in these strong points, the choice had been made long before the Americans arrived. Death in combat was preferable to the shame of capture, and they would extract whatever cost they could from the invaders before meeting that end. The mopping-up operations that characterized the second day of fighting were methodical and grueling, bearing little resemblance to the dramatic beach assault that had preceded them. American squads moved inland from the beachhead, advancing slowly through terrain littered with debris from the naval bombardment. Concrete structures lay fractured and overturned. Palm trees had been reduced to splintered stumps. The ground itself seemed scorched and alien, bearing the scars of days of continuous shelling. Yet within this devastation, Japanese soldiers remained active, firing from positions that appeared destroyed on first glance. Bunkers with multiple levels beneath ground level had protected their occupants from the worst of the bombardment. Anti-tank obstacles and barbed wire entanglements still functioned as barriers against the American advance. Each American unit moving across Engebi understood that danger persisted despite the overwhelming display of firepower that had preceded them. The pace of the American advance reflected both tactical caution and the nature of the resistance they encountered. Rather than rushing forward in exposed formations, Marines moved carefully, using fire and maneuver techniques developed through months of amphibious combat across the Pacific. Machine gun teams would establish suppressive fire, while rifle squads flanked Japanese positions. Engineers with flame weapons advanced behind the riflemen, preparing to assault bunkers that refused to surrender. This choreography of violence was born from hard experience on other islands, from lessons written in blood on places like Tarawa and Betio. Every meter gained was covered by supporting fire. Every Japanese position was thoroughly cleared before American forces moved beyond it. The cost of haste in this type of warfare was catastrophic, and the commanders at Engebi understood that momentum had to be balanced against casualty rates that would ripple through the entire invasion schedule. Japanese resistance on Engebi varied in intensity and organization, depending on the location and quality of the fortifications. Some positions were overrun quickly when direct assaults overwhelmed the defenders before they could coordinate effective fire. Other strong points resisted with ferocity, their defenders committing to final stands that saw entire squads fight until they were killed to a man rather than retreat to secondary positions. The underground bunker systems proved particularly troublesome. A bunker that appeared to be a pile of rubble from the air could house 20 or 30 defenders in a network of passages that extended downward into the island's coral base. Marines learned to approach such positions with caution, working methodically to cover all potential exit routes before committing to assault. Grenades lobbed through observation ports, and apertures often failed to produce the desired effect. Flamethrowers, which had proven devastating in other campaigns, sometimes faltered when Japanese defenders retreated into deeper chambers where the flames could not reach. The battle for Engebi was being decided not on the beaches where cameras captured the dramatic moments, but in these narrow, bitter struggles for individual fortifications. The American casualties accumulated steadily through the 20th of February as the mopping-up operations continued across the northern islands of the atoll. Young men who had survived the beach landing and the initial inland push were wounded or killed clearing secondary positions that had seemed less dangerous than the main defensive line. Corpsmen worked continuously, moving between casualties, applying tourniquets and field dressings to wounds that ranged from minor to catastrophic. Stretcher bearers carried the wounded back toward the beaches, where landing craft stood ready to transport them to hospital ships waiting offshore. The psychological toll on the survivors was substantial. For many Marines, this was only their second or third engagement. The constant exposure to enemy fire, the inability to distinguish between areas of relative safety and areas where sniper fire or machine gun bursts might come without warning, ground down the nervous system over the course of hours and days. By the end of the second day of fighting on Engebi, exhausted Marines were clearing the island's interior, with the mechanical efficiency of men operating at the edge of their physical and mental endurance. The American command structure worked to maintain momentum across Engebi, while simultaneously preparing for the next phase of the operation against the more heavily fortified Parry Island. Officers and non-commissioned officers coordinated the movement of units, ensuring that isolated resistance pockets were eliminated without bunching up forces where they might be caught by artillery fire from other islands. Intelligence officers interrogated captured Japanese soldiers, seeking information about the strength and disposition of forces on Parry. Engineers surveyed Engebi, identifying suitable locations for the establishment of support facilities and artillery positions that would support the assault on the islands to the south. The narrow streets between military objectives meant that the battle for Engebi, while tactically successful, occurred within the context of a larger strategic operation that was unfolding across multiple fronts simultaneously. Naval gunfire support continued to be available, with destroyers and cruisers standing offshore, ready to suppress any Japanese attempt to reinforce Engebi from other parts of the atoll or to launch organized counterattacks. By the evening of the 20th of February, Engebi Island was declared secure, though the declaration came with the understanding that isolated Japanese soldiers would likely continue to emerge from hiding places for weeks to come. The official count of Japanese defenders killed was several hundred, though the exact number remained subject to revision as mopping-up operations continued. A handful of Japanese soldiers had been captured alive, representing a remarkable departure from the patterns established in earlier Pacific campaigns. The American count showed several hundred Marines killed and wounded, a total that reflected both the intensity of the fighting and the effectiveness of Japanese defensive positions that survived the preliminary bombardment. The division commander evaluated the progress with satisfaction. The first phase of the operation had proceeded faster than the most optimistic intelligence estimates had suggested. The path forward to Parry Island was now open, and the engineering units could begin their work to establish the infrastructure necessary to support the next assault. Engineers moved across Engebi with the same systematic approach that had characterized the infantry assault. They surveyed terrain, identified damaged areas suitable for repair, and began planning the construction of supply dumps, ammunition storage, and fuel depots. The airfield facilities on Engebi, which had been the target of repeated bombing runs and would continue to receive damage from American strikes until the island was secured, were now assessed for potential restoration. Japanese aircraft that had operated from these facilities had long since departed or been destroyed. The runway itself was usable, despite the craters left by bombs and shells, and engineers prioritized its repair as a matter of urgent importance. An operational airfield on Engebi would provide forward basing for American fighters and bombers, shortening the range of aircraft supporting the assault on the remaining islands and eliminating the need for some of the longer missions that strained logistics and pilot endurance. Working parties of men without infantry assignments began filling bomb craters and dragging debris clear of the runway. The transformation of a defeated enemy position into an American facility was a process that had been refined through months of island campaigns, and Engebi would follow this well-established pattern. The psychological shift that occurred once Engebi was secured represented a crucial turning point in the mental posture of the American invasion force. The initial assault had succeeded. The defenders had not been the impenetrable barrier that pre-invasion intelligence had suggested might be possible. Japanese fortifications, while serious obstacles that had extracted a cost in blood, had proven vulnerable to American firepower and tactical coordination. This realization spread through the officer corps and among the enlisted men who would form the assault waves against Parry Island. Confidence grew, though not to the point of overconfidence. Veterans of the Engebi fighting understood that the remaining islands, particularly Parry, were more heavily fortified and would mount more organized resistance. The senior commanders studied the lessons from Engebi, evaluating what had worked effectively in their artillery preparation, what had failed to neutralize Japanese positions, and how the assault tactics would need to be adjusted for the larger, more complex battle ahead. Reports from forward observers and intelligence officers were compiled and analyzed. The preliminary bombardment that would precede the assault on Parry was being planned with the benefit of practical experience rather than speculation. Supply operations swung into motion with remarkable efficiency as soon as Engebi's security was confirmed. Landing craft shuttled back and forth between the beach and the transport vessels anchored offshore, delivering ammunition, rations, water, and medical supplies. The beach itself was reorganized as a flow of materiel, with Supply Sergeant maintaining careful accounting of everything that was being stockpiled. The Navy had learned from earlier campaigns that supply failures could bring an invasion to a halt as surely as enemy resistance, and logistical planning had become as vital to operational success as tactical coordination. For the men on the ground, the arrival of food that was not from field rations, the opportunity to refill canteens with fresh water, and the knowledge that ammunition stocks were being replenished meant that Engebi felt less like an embattled position and more like the foundation of a forward operating base. The transition from combat to consolidation represented a shift in the rhythm of the operation, though one that maintained constant alertness to the possibility of enemy activity. Artillery batteries were moved ashore and emplaced in positions selected to provide fire support for operations against Parry Island. Forward observers climbed to elevated positions to conduct reconnaissance and to develop fire plans based on the geography they could now observe directly rather than from aerial photographs. The human cost of the Engebi operation began to be fully understood as casualty reports were consolidated and medical personnel processed the wounded. The figures revealed that approximately 700 Japanese soldiers had been killed in defense of the island, while a smaller number had been captured alive. American casualties included more than 200 killed and several hundred more wounded. These numbers, while far lower than the human cost of fighting across heavily populated islands like Saipan or Iwo Jima would prove to be, represented a genuine price paid in human life for the strategic objective of seizing the northern islands of the atoll. For every statistic in the casualty report, there were individual stories of men experiencing combat for the first time, of leadership demonstrated under fire, and of soldiers helping wounded comrades, even when doing so placed them in danger. Medical personnel worked around the clock in aid stations and aboard hospital ships, and the surgeons aboard those ships made decisions about treatment that would determine whether men would walk away from this war or carry its scars for the remainder of their lives. The completion of Engebi's consolidation by the evening of the 20th of February marked a transition point in the broader operation. The assault force had proven itself capable of overwhelming Japanese defensive positions through coordination of naval bombardment, airstrikes, and infantry assault tactics. Engineers and support personnel had demonstrated their ability to establish forward bases in hostile terrain, while security operations continued against remaining enemy soldiers. The intelligence gathered from Engebi was being processed and incorporated into plans for the assault on Parry Island, where Major Kitano and the strongest concentration of Japanese defenders awaited. The ships and aircraft remained in position, ready to shift their fires from Engebi to the southern islands. The Marines who had fought on the 20th rested, resupplied, and prepared themselves mentally and physically for the battles that remained. Behind the initial assault waves, additional units were being prepared for landing to support the breakthrough. The operation against the Japanese defensive perimeter was proceeding according to plan, though with the understanding that each successive phase would likely prove more difficult and more costly than the last. Engebi had been secured. Now the real test lay ahead. The American forces that secured Engebi Island had bought themselves time and a foothold, but they had not won the atoll. 3 kilometers to the south, across waters both shallow and treacherous, lay Parry Island. This narrow strip of coral and sand, no more than 2.5 kilometers long and perhaps 400 meters across at its widest point, held the strongest concentration of Japanese defenses in the entire Marshall Islands campaign. What American planners knew, what submarines had reported, what aerial photographs had revealed through careful interpretation, was that Major Masaji Kitano had spent nearly a year turning Parry into a fortress. The Major had not merely constructed defensive positions, he had engineered a layered, interconnected system of fortifications that extended from the beaches into the interior of the island, creating what he believed would be an impenetrable barrier against American assault. Officers studying the reconnaissance photographs in the fleet's operations centers understood that Parry would be fundamentally different from Engebi. They were looking not at hastily prepared positions, but at the mature result of sustained, methodical engineering effort combined with the accumulated tactical wisdom of Japan's Pacific War experience. The Japanese had learned bitter lessons at islands like Tarawa and Kwajalein. They had watched American amphibious assaults evolve, had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of naval gunfire, had understood that control of the air above an atoll was now non-negotiable in any island defense. Kitano and his engineers had absorbed these lessons and applied them to Parry with cold precision. The island's beaches, which would be the inevitable point of American invasion, had been prepared with meticulous care. Barbed wire entanglements stretched along the high tide line, designed not to stop men, but to slow them, to channel them into pre-established killing zones where Japanese machine guns and mortars waited to harvest casualties. Behind these beach obstacles, the Japanese had constructed a continuous line of trenches and rifle pits. These were not shallow scratchings, but properly dug defensive positions, some deep enough to allow a man to stand upright. Anti-tank obstacles, concrete and steel, jutted from the sand at angles calculated to disrupt the movement of any amphibious vehicles attempting to cross the beaches and push inland. Yet the beaches were only the outer shell of Parry's defences. Beyond them lay the real architecture of the fortress. The Japanese had constructed concrete blockhouses at critical points, structures that could withstand all but direct hits from the heaviest naval guns. These blockhouses, some measuring 5 meters in length and 3 meters in width, had walls nearly a meter thick and were reinforced with steel rods and railroad rails driven through the concrete. Each one was positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across the beaches and adjacent areas. The Japanese had learned that wood burned and collapsed, but concrete endured. They had also learned that a position that could only shoot forward was vulnerable to flanking attack. Therefore, the blockhouses were arranged in a network where each position could support its neighbours, and the loss of one position would not create an impenetrable gap in the defensive line. Behind these primary strongpoints lay secondary positions, gun emplacements that could continue the fight even if the outer positions fell. Ammunition was stored in underground magazines, protected from naval bombardment. Water was collected and stored in concealed cisterns. The Japanese garrison had prepared for siege as much as for assault. The interior of Parry held perhaps the most formidable defensive feature of all. The Japanese engineers had constructed what would become known as the main line of resistance, a continuous underground fortification system that stretched across the narrowest part of the island. This line consisted of interconnected trenches, some covered with logs and coral, creating bunkers that could provide shelter while still allowing defenders to fire across the approaches. At key points along this line stood what American intelligence recognized as anti-tank blockhouses, structures designed specifically to stop or slow armored vehicles. The guns in these blockhouses were positioned to rake any approaching column with cannon fire. The overall effect was a fortress that American planners recognized would demand not a single assault, but a series of coordinated strikes, each building upon the gains of the previous attack. Naval gunfire could suppress the defenses and kill exposed defenders, but ultimately, American soldiers would have to come ashore and fight through this carefully engineered position. Reconnaissance officers, studying aerial photographs and intelligence reports, began to appreciate the skill with which this defensive system had been arranged. The photographs showed gun emplacements positioned to cover the beaches from multiple angles. They showed concrete structures that reconnaissance experts assessed could survive anything less than a direct hit from a heavy naval gun. They showed communication trenches connecting positions, allowing defenders to reinforce threatened areas and maintain unified command despite American attempts to break the line through concentrated bombardment. Intelligence reports indicated that Major Kitano himself remained on the island, that he had not been evacuated despite the American dominance of the air and sea. This was significant. Japanese commanders who had been captured or whose diaries had been discovered had emphasized that Kitano was a careful, methodical officer who planned defensively rather than seeking aggressive encounters. He would not waste lives on counterattacks unless the tactical situation demanded it. He would hold his positions, make the Americans pay for every meter of ground, and extract the maximum casualties before the island fell. The American invasion planners developed their assault scheme based on this understanding of Parry's defenses. The first phase would involve an intensive bombardment, more sustained and concentrated than even the preliminary strikes against Engebi. Battleships that had already demonstrated their capability to suppress Japanese defenses would be positioned to rake Parry's gun positions with repeated salvos. Cruisers would provide rapid fire against targets of opportunity. Destroyers would add their guns to the bombardment. Carrier aircraft would strike at any positions that seemed to escape the naval gunfire, particularly anti-aircraft emplacements that might threaten the assault force's gunfire support ships. The bombardment was not merely intended to kill Japanese soldiers. It was meant to damage fortifications, to collapse bunkers, to cut barbed wire, to disrupt the carefully arranged defensive system that Kitano had created. American planners knew from hard experience that no bombardment, however intensive, would eliminate all defensive positions. Japanese soldiers sheltered in deep bunkers would survive even the heaviest shelling. The bombardment's purpose was to suppress those defenses, to keep Japanese soldiers' heads down at the critical moment when American assault troops waded ashore. The assault itself would follow a pattern that American forces had refined over months of island campaigns. The 22nd Regiment of the 4th Marine Division would form the assault force, with attached Army units providing support. These Marines had trained in amphibious assault, had learned how to move under fire, how to employ covering fire, and maneuvering tactics to advance against defended positions. They would come ashore in waves, using amphibious vehicles where possible to provide transportation and protection from fire. Once on the beach, they would immediately consolidate positions and push inland, using fire and movement tactics to overcome Japanese resistance. Follow-on forces would reinforce the initial assault, broadening the beachhead and preventing Japanese counterattacks from pushing the Americans back into the sea. The artillery would move inland with the assault troops, establishing itself to provide fire support as the Marines advanced deeper into the island against subsequent defensive lines. The intelligence officers responsible for advising the assault force commanders had to make difficult assessments. How many Japanese soldiers held Parry? Estimates varied, but the consensus suggested approximately 3,000 or somewhat more. This force was not raw conscripts hastily assembled. Many were battle-hardened veterans who had fought in previous island campaigns or in China. The garrison included engineers and specialists who had constructed the fortifications and understood every aspect of their design. The supply situation suggested that the Japanese had stockpiled ammunition, food, and water to sustain the garrison for an extended siege. Tokyo had made clear to its commanders that Parry was not to be lightly surrendered. The strategic importance of the Marshall Islands meant that any island lost would represent a breach in Japan's defensive perimeter. The loss of Eniwetok would already be a psychological blow to the homeland. The loss of Parry would confirm that the American advance could not be stopped by defensive positions alone. This understanding permeated Japanese command circles. Kitano had received his orders through formal military channels. He understood his duty. He would hold Parry, and he would make the Americans pay the price in blood for whatever ground they ultimately took. The Americans gathered at their staging areas, studying maps and aerial photographs, discussing the assault plan with their unit leaders. Platoon commanders rehearsed their men in assault tactics. Squad leaders verified that their soldiers had the specific weapons and equipment necessary for the fighting ahead. Riflemen cleaned their weapons obsessively, understanding that a jammed rifle at the moment of assault could be fatal. Machine gunners calibrated their weapons, calculated firing solutions for the likely defensive positions they would encounter. Mortar crews practiced their calculations, learning the adjustments necessary to hit targets on an island most of them had never seen, except in photographs. The engineers who would demolish Japanese fortifications assembled satchel charges and prepared the fuses and detonators they would need. Flamethrower teams tested their equipment, Understanding that this weapon would be crucial for clearing bunkers and blockhouses, corpsmen checked their medical supplies, knowing that Parry would demand everything medicine could offer. The assault plan itself reflected American strategic choices and tactical doctrine refined over years of Pacific War experience. The beaches selected for the assault were those that provided the most direct route to the most critical Japanese positions. The bombardment would be timed to begin before dawn, lasting several hours to ensure maximum effect when visibility improved. Carrier aircraft would provide air support throughout the assault and beyond, protecting the invasion fleet from Japanese counterattack and striking Japanese positions that seemed to be staging reserves for counteroffensive action. Naval gunfire ships would remain on station throughout the assault, ready to shift their fire to support the advancing Marines. The assault troops themselves would be concentrated, with multiple companies assaulting simultaneously, rather than in narrow frontage that might allow Japanese defenders to concentrate their own fire on a thin beachhead. The plan emphasized speed and aggressive forward movement. American commanders understood that once the assault began, momentum would be critical. Slowing down, allowing Japanese defenses to recover and organize counterattacks would be fatal to the American effort. The preliminary bombardment began precisely when operations officers calculated it should. From positions that took them out of range of most Japanese defensive guns, American battleships and cruisers opened fire with systematic, methodical precision. The first salvos fell on known or suspected anti-aircraft positions. Japanese guns that had been positioned to protect the atoll against carrier aircraft found themselves targeted by naval gunfire they could not answer. The bombardment continued through the hours before dawn, maintained during the first hours of morning light. American spotters called adjustments, correcting the aim of the great naval guns. Each salvo that fell on target destroyed fortifications, killed exposed defenders, wounded others, and created a psychological effect on the garrison struggling to survive in the bombardment. This was the prelude to invasion. This was the sound of Japanese power in the atoll being systematically dismantled by forces the garrison could not directly engage. Officers overseeing the bombardment understood that they were setting conditions for the assault to come, reducing the defensive strength of the fortress and diminishing the ability of Major Kitano's garrison to deliver devastating fire against the American troops who would soon wade across the beaches toward the island's interior. What American assault commanders could not see beneath the bombardment was how much damage was actually being achieved. Japanese soldiers who had survived previous bombardments crouched in their bunkers, enduring the concussions of explosions, hearing the crash of shells all around them. Some positions collapsed. Some ammunition magazines were hit directly, exploding with force that killed everyone near them. Some gun crews were killed outright. Other positions were damaged but remained defensible. Some guns that had been previously positioned were shifted before the bombardment began, moved to secondary positions that had been previously dug. The network of bunkers and fortifications that Kitano had engineered proved to be notably resilient. It would take more than bombardment to eliminate this fortress. It would take the assault of American infantry, the application of tactical skill and courage at the point of contact with the defenders. And that assault was coming, with each passing hour bringing the Marine assault force closer to the beaches where the true battle for Parry would begin. The morning of February 21st dawned grey and humid over Parry Island. The American fleet had repositioned overnight, and now the great ships lay in ordered rows across the lagoon, their gun crews already at their stations. The bombardment that was about to begin would be unlike anything previously witnessed in the Pacific War. What had succeeded at Engebi? Speed, surprise, overwhelming firepower. would now be tested against a target exponentially more dangerous. Major Masagi Kitano's garrison on Parry numbered nearly 2,000 men, dug into concrete bunkers and underground fortifications that Engebi's defenders had lacked. The Japanese commander had months to prepare this ground, and every advantage of terrain and engineering had been exploited. American planners understood that the beach assault would be a meat grinder unless those defenses could be shattered beforehand. The only way to achieve that was through tonnage, precision, and unrelenting intensity. At 0600 hours, the bombardment commenced. The battleships North Carolina, South Dakota, and Massachusetts opened fire first. Their massive 16-inch guns hurling projectiles each the weight of a small automobile toward the island. The sound was beyond description. Not a single explosion, but a cascading, rolling thunder that seemed to crack the air itself apart. Cruisers joined the fire moment by moment, adding their 8-inch and 6-inch guns to the chorus of destruction. The destroyers followed, their smaller caliber weapons no less deadly for their modest size. For the next hour, approximately 250 tons of ordnance fell onto Parry Island every 60 seconds. Men standing on nearby vessels felt the shock waves physically, a pressure against the chest that made breathing difficult. The island itself seemed to convulse under the assault. Pillars of smoke and dust rose thousands of feet into the air, obscuring the Japanese positions beneath a roiling cloud that turned the morning into twilight. The American bombardment followed a careful pattern. Naval gunnery officers, using spotting aircraft and intelligence maps, directed fire onto known and suspected defensive positions. The southern beaches where the Marines would land received particular attention. Anti-tank obstacles were obliterated. Gun emplacements marked on intelligence maps were pounded repeatedly to ensure that any gun crew attempting to man them would find only rubble and corpses. The Japanese had constructed a sophisticated network of interconnected bunkers with overlapping fields of fire, but concrete and steel, no matter how well engineered, could not withstand this magnitude of punishment. Each major fortification received multiple hits. When a battleship shell struck a bunker, the structure would collapse inward, burying defenders who moments before had thought themselves safe in their reinforced positions. The cumulative effect was meant to be both physical destruction and psychological collapse. Japanese soldiers enduring hours of this bombardment would emerge traumatized, their morale shattered, their coordination destroyed by the incessant noise and vibration. By mid-morning, the carrier aircraft joined the assault. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo bombers approached from the north and east, their engines adding another layer to the overwhelming sensory assault. They attacked in coordinated groups, hitting airfield facilities, ammunition dumps, and fuel storage areas that had been identified by reconnaissance. The Japanese possessed anti-aircraft guns positioned across the island, and some fired back with desperate intensity, sending tracer rounds skyward in brilliant arcs. American pilots, hardened by months of Pacific combat, pressed their attacks regardless. Some aircraft were hit and trailed smoke as they turned back toward the fleet. Others disappeared entirely, their crews lost to Japanese gunfire or mechanical failure. But the bombers kept coming. They were operating under conditions of near-total air superiority. The few Japanese fighters that might have contested their presence had been destroyed in earlier strikes or were being held back as a reserve. The sky above Parry had become an American dominion, and the island below received the undivided attention of hundreds of tons of bombs and rockets. Between the naval gunfire and the airstrikes, the bombardment continued relentlessly. Artillery commanders made calculations about ammunition expenditure, fuel usage, and the maintenance of bombardment intensity. They understood that their ships carried only a finite amount of ordnance, and resupply was days away. But for now, there was enough. The psychological dimension of the bombardment cannot be overstated. Japanese defenders crouching in their shelters heard the constant roar of explosions, felt the island shake beneath them, witnessed cracks spreading through their carefully constructed fortifications. Some positions that had seemed impregnable during planning suddenly looked desperately fragile. Officers moved through the bunkers, checking on their men's morale. Many soldiers were experiencing their first serious American bombardment, and the reality proved far more terrible than even the most pessimistic predictions. Experienced NCOs who had survived other campaigns told newer troops that the Americans were merely warming up, that this was nothing compared to what would come tomorrow. Whether such statements bolstered courage or deepened despair depended on the listener. By afternoon, the bombardment had settled into a more systematic pattern. The initial frenzy had given way to precise, methodical destruction. Fire control parties directed shells toward specific targets. Spotting aircraft circled overhead, reporting results and calling corrections. A Japanese bunker would be targeted, pounded by multiple ships simultaneously, then bombed again by aircraft. When fires erupted in ammunition dumps, American gunners would shift their fire to keep Japanese from extinguishing the flames. Fuel tanks that had once held aviation gasoline burned with black smoke that rose in a column visible from the fleet. The logistics of Japanese defense were being systematically dismantled. Medical stations were destroyed. Supply depots were obliterated. Communication trenches were cut by shell fire. The island's infrastructure, never extensive to begin with, was being reduced to rubble. Engineers attempting repairs were themselves targeted by observant spotters. The Americans were not merely attacking military positions, they were conducting a comprehensive annihilation of anything that might support Japanese resistance. As evening approached on February 21st, the bombardment had achieved a terrible rhythm. Ships would fire for an hour, then shift position to avoid Japanese counter-battery fire, or simply to allow their gun crews brief respite. The pause was never long, and other vessels would take up the fire. Throughout the night, the bombardment continued at reduced intensity, but without ceasing entirely. American commanders understood that Japanese commanders often attempted night counterattacks or reinforcement operations using covered darkness. Sporadic fire throughout the hours of darkness would keep Japanese troops from organizing such efforts. Flares and searchlights would illuminate suspected movement. The psychological weight of knowing that bombardment could resume at any moment kept Japanese defenders in a state of exhaustion and anxiety. Sleep became impossible. Some soldiers collapsed from sheer exhaustion, only to jerk awake when a stray shell landed nearby. Officers circulated through positions, demanding that men remain alert despite their physical and mental deterioration. The morning of February 22nd brought renewed intensity to the bombardment. The American ships had spent the night repositioning, receiving ammunition from supply vessels, and allowing crews to eat and rest in shifts. As dawn broke, the guns opened fire again with fresh fury. The bombardment plan for this second day focused more heavily on the beach defenses and the areas where intelligence suggested the heaviest concentration of Japanese troops. The assumption was that Kitano would have concentrated his garrison in positions to defend against the inevitable amphibious assault. Those positions became the targets of choice. Machine gun nests were blown apart. Mortar emplacements were pulverized. Anti-tank guns that had been carefully emplaced to cover approaches to the beach were destroyed or so damaged that they would be useless when landing craft appeared. The American naval gunnery was executed with professional precision that reflected months of training and previous combat experience. Gunnery officers had learned their craft through hard experience at Tarawa and other islands. This bombardment reflected everything they had learned about effective supporting fire for amphibious operations. Carrier aircraft continued their strikes throughout the second day with relentless consistency. The fighters came down in strafing runs, their machine guns adding to the explosive fury. Dive bombers released their ordnance from controlled angles, achieving remarkable accuracy given the primitive technology of the era. The Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, already degraded by the previous day's bombardment, were further weakened. Crews manning the guns were killed or driven from their positions by explosions nearby. Some anti-aircraft positions were buried under rubble, becoming unmarked tombs. American pilots began to note that the intensity of anti-aircraft fire was diminishing. This suggested that the bombardment was achieving its objective of rendering Japanese defenses ineffective. Some pilots reported that Japanese positions seemed to be offering only sporadic, ineffectual resistance. This intelligence was communicated back to the fleet, where commanders accepted it as confirmation that the bombardment plan was succeeding. The cumulative tonnage of ordnance expended during the 21st and 22nd was staggering. Battleships alone had fired hundreds of major caliber shells. Cruisers had contributed thousands of smaller rounds. Destroyers, despite their modest firepower compared to capital ships, had fired continuously. Aircraft had dropped tens of thousands of pounds of ordnance. Conservative estimates suggested that the bombardment had delivered approximately 2,000 tons of explosives onto Parry Island during those 2 days. What remained of the island when darkness fell on February 22nd was a moonscape of craters, rubble, and burning wreckage. The airfield was cratered beyond use. The fuel storage areas were burning or destroyed. The ammunition dumps had been hit repeatedly, creating cascading explosions that spread destruction far beyond the initial impact areas. The coral substrate of the island, never deep, had been churned and broken. A first-time observer might have concluded that nothing could possibly survive in that devastation, that the bombardment had effectively eliminated all organized resistance. Yet the reality would prove more complicated. Japanese bunkers, despite their vulnerability to direct hits, had saved many lives through their construction. Underground positions, properly designed and positioned, could withstand nearby explosions. Engineers had learned lessons from previous bombardments and had incorporated redundancy into the defensive system. Multiple small bunkers, widely dispersed, offered better survival odds than concentrated positions. Many of Kitano's garrison had endured the bombardment in shock and trauma, but fundamentally intact as a military force. The commander himself had survived, sheltering in a deeply buried command post. Junior officers and NCOs had preserved enough organization to attempt coordinated defense when American forces landed. The bombardment would prove psychologically and physically devastating, but it would not achieve what American planners hoped. The Japanese would not be broken. They would not surrender. They would emerge from their bunkers traumatized and diminished in numbers, but possessed of a fierce determination to resist to the final moment. As night fell on February 22nd, the bombardment diminished but did not cease. American commanders, operating on the assumption that heavy destruction equaled easy victory, were satisfied with the punishment they had inflicted. The landing craft would assault at dawn on February 22nd. The Marines would carry their rifles and flamethrowers and explosives onto beaches that American firepower had supposedly rendered untenable. They would discover, as Marines had discovered at Tarawa before them, and would discover again and again across the Pacific, that bombardment, no matter how intensive, no matter how thorough, could not eliminate a determined enemy willing to die in defense of their position. The stage for human combat on Parry Island had been set. The physical preparations were complete. The artillery and aviation had done all that machinery and explosives could accomplish. Now it would fall to the Marines and Army soldiers to complete the destruction of Kitano's garrison through direct assault, to close with an enemy that had survived the greatest bombardment it had yet endured, and now faced the prospect of defending concrete bunkers and fortified positions against infantry assault. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 22nd of February 1944, the waters surrounding Parry Island churned with the movement of American assault craft. The men of the 22nd Regiment of the 4th Marine Division sat in their landing craft, checking weapons for the 100th time, their faces painted with camouflage, their minds focused on the single objective that lay before them. Behind them, the American naval bombardment had continued through the previous day and into the night, a relentless pounding that shook the very earth of the island and sent plumes of smoke and fire into the sky. Yet everyone aboard those boats understood a fundamental truth about amphibious warfare. No amount of naval gunfire could guarantee that the beaches would be easy, or that the Japanese defenders would be sufficiently weakened to permit an unopposed landing. The intelligence reports had been clear on one point. Parry Island was the strongest position in the atoll, and Major Masaji Kitano had prepared it with meticulous care. The Marines knew they were about to collide with the heart of Japanese resistance in Eniwetok. The island itself presented a stark and hellish tableau as the first light of dawn crept across the lagoon. Where bombardment had struck, the ground lay scarred and torn, littered with the debris of fortifications and the remnants of structures that had been vaporized by high explosive shells. Yet the coral rock of Parry absorbed punishment in ways that sand alone could not, and the Japanese had learned over many months to build in layers, to disperse their gun positions, and to protect their strongest defenses beneath tons of earth and reinforced concrete. From the air, observers could see that much of the island remained intact, despite the titanic violence of the previous 2 days. Anti-tank obstacles still studded the beaches, metal obstacles, concrete teeth, and steel rails driven into the sand and coral in patterns designed to slow and channel attacking forces into interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese guns, concealed in bunkers and fortified positions, had been struck but not silenced. Many would survive the morning's final bombardment to wreak havoc on the Americans who dared to cross the reef and assault the beaches. At approximately 0900 hours, the preliminary airstrikes began their final crescendo. Carrier-based dive bombers and torpedo bombers screamed down toward Parry, their wings trailing smoke and fire as they released ordnance onto the island's defensive positions. The explosions cascaded across the island in thunderous waves, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though nothing could possibly survive such concentrated violence. But even as the last aircraft pulled up and headed back to their carriers, the defenders were already emerging from their shelters, running through the smoke and dust to their battle stations. Officers barked orders. Non-commissioned officers moved ammunition and weapons into final position, and machine gunners slid into their embrasures with a grim determination that no amount of bombing could extinguish. The Japanese defenders understood that their moment had come, that the Americans would land within the hour, and that their survival and the defense of their position depended on their ability to respond with overwhelming firepower when the American assault craft touched the beach. The bombardment lifted at approximately 0930 hours, and in that moment of sudden silence, the American assault could begin. Amtraks and landing craft, their engines churning the shallow water of the lagoon into foam, moved steadily toward Parry's beaches in coordinated waves. Each craft carried between 20 and 30 fighting men, packed shoulder to shoulder, their weapons held at port arms, their eyes fixed on the shoreline that grew larger with each passing second. The sailors who piloted the craft stood at their controls, watching for reefs and obstacles, calculating the precise angle of approach that would deliver their human cargo into the fight. Some of the men aboard those vessels were veteran Marines who had fought on Guadalcanal and other islands, but many were replacements and reinforcements, men who had never heard a shot fired in anger, who had never seen their friends killed by enemy fire. For these younger soldiers, the approach to the beach was a passage into a new and terrible world, one from which they might not return. The impact of the first assault waves hitting the coral beach of Parry Island was less a gentle arrival than a collision with fate. Men splashed into knee-deep water, jumped from their craft into the surge of the lagoon, waded toward the beach with their rifles held high to keep them dry. The sky above them, which had been filled with the thunder of American explosions only moments before, suddenly erupted with Japanese fire. Machine guns concealed in bunkers and fortified positions opened up with a chattering roar that seemed to come from every direction at once. The water around the wading Marines began to churn as bullets struck home, and men who had been moving steadily forward suddenly stopped, staggered, or fell into the shallow water. The beach itself became a hellscape of fire and confusion as Japanese defenders, having survived the preliminary bombardment, emerged to defend their positions with the full fury of their concentrated firepower. The initial waves of American assault troops took catastrophic casualties as they crossed the reef and approached the beach. Machine gun positions, protected by concrete and earth, poured fire across the open ground at point-blank range. Japanese mortars, hidden in sheltered positions, began firing on the boats still making their approach, exploding in the shallow water and sending spray and shrapnel across the assault craft. Officers and non-commissioned officers shouted orders, urging their men forward even as the men beside them were cut down by the withering fusillade. Some Marines and soldiers fell behind coral obstacles or used the bodies of their fallen comrades as momentary protection while they returned fire. Others pressed forward with a desperate courage, running across the beach in short, violent sprints, seeking any shelter that might protect them from the storm of lead and high explosive that seemed to be coming from the entire length of the Japanese line. The Japanese defenders, fighting from prepared positions that had been weeks in the construction, held every advantage in those first crucial minutes. They could see the American assault craft approaching across the open lagoon with nowhere to hide. They had studied the beaches, calculated firing solutions, and registered their weapons on specific points where the American troops would be most vulnerable. Machine gunners had interlocking fields of fire that left almost no approach undefended. Anti-tank guns, though the Americans had no tanks in the assault, could be used as anti-personnel weapons with devastating effect at close range. And underneath it all, the Japanese command structure remained intact even after the bombardment, with officers and non-commissioned officers calling out corrections and directing the fire of their subordinates with methodical precision. The American landings on Engebi had been difficult enough, but Parry presented an entirely different level of organized resistance. Yet despite the violence and the casualties, the American assault did not break or falter. Men who landed in the first waves, reduced to perhaps half their original numbers by Japanese fire, established small positions on the beach and began to consolidate their hold. Those who came ashore in subsequent waves found these positions and used them as anchors for their own arrival. Officers and sergeants, their voices hoarse from shouting over the noise of combat, organized counterfire and attempted to suppress the Japanese gun positions long enough for reinforcements to land and expand the beachhead. Flamethrowers, carried ashore by brave men who knew they were walking targets, began to play their terrible fire across Japanese fortifications, burning out bunkers and forcing defenders to abandon positions or die in the flames. Demolitions teams began the dangerous work of clearing obstacles from the beach, crawling forward under fire to plant explosives on anti-tank barriers and concrete obstacles. The battle for Parry, though only minutes old, had already settled into a pattern of desperate violence and grinding American determination. By mid-morning on the 22nd of February, the Americans had managed to establish a tenuous beachhead on Parry Island, though at a cost that seemed almost unbearable to those who had fought their way ashore. The beach itself was littered with wounded and dead, with discarded equipment and the detritus of the assault. Japanese fire continued to rake the shoreline, though the defenders had been forced to fall back slightly from their most forward positions as American troops gained a foothold. The Japanese defenders, however, showed no sign of collapse or faltering. Major Kitano had built his defensive position with the explicit understanding that the Americans would eventually land, and he had prepared his garrison for exactly this moment. The defenders fell back to secondary positions only when absolutely forced to do so, and they prepared to conduct their defense in depth, using their buried fortifications and the natural features of the island to make every inch of ground purchased in blood. The expansion of the American beachhead throughout the remainder of the 22nd of February was a slow and agonizing process of yard-by-yard advance against a skilled and determined enemy. Landing craft continued to arrive, bringing fresh troops, ammunition, and supplies, though the beach remained a dangerous place where shells and machine gun fire continued to take their toll. Tanks and other vehicles began to arrive in the afternoon, their arrival a turning point in the tactical situation, as their guns could be brought to bear on Japanese fortifications with devastating effect. But the tanks themselves became priority targets for Japanese defenders, many of whom were equipped with anti-tank rifles or had access to anti-tank guns that had survived the bombardment. The fighting remained confused and violent throughout the daylight hours, with Japanese counterattacks emerging from hidden positions at irregular intervals, each one met with overwhelming American firepower. By the time darkness fell on the 22nd of February, the Americans had expanded their beachhead to perhaps a few hundred yards inland, though the casualty count had risen to hundreds of men killed and wounded. As night fell on Parry Island, the fighting did not cease but merely changed in character. Illumination shells burst overhead, casting an eerie flickering light across the island and the lagoon beyond. Japanese defenders, aware that American firepower was most effective during daylight hours, prepared to conduct night attacks and counterattacks that they hoped might catch the Americans disorganized or depleted. Small groups of Japanese soldiers moved through the darkness, attempting to infiltrate American lines or re-establish contact with positions that had been lost during the day. American forces, mindful of Japanese night fighting tactics from previous island campaigns, established perimeter defenses and prepared to meet any assault with disciplined firepower. The night on Parry Island was filled with the sounds of sporadic gunfire, the crack of grenades, and the cries of wounded men calling out for medics or for their mothers in languages both American and Japanese. The beach itself remained a hellscape of shadows and death, where wounded men lay exposed to the elements and occasionally to sniper fire, waiting for dawn and the promise of medical evacuation. The fighting on Parry Island through the night of the 22nd and into the early hours of the 23rd of February established the pattern that would define the entire battle for control of the island. The Americans had established their beachhead, and could not be driven back into the sea, but neither could they break through the Japanese defensive positions with the speed and decisiveness that American commanders had hoped for. The defenses that Major Kitano had so carefully constructed over the previous months were proving their worth in the crucible of combat, slowing American momentum and extracting a heavy price in casualties from each yard of ground taken. The Americans possessed superior firepower, superior numbers, and the ability to bring reinforcements and supplies ashore in relative safety. But these advantages would not make the conquest of Parry Island swift or painless. The battle would extend through multiple days of grinding, brutal combat, with casualties mounting steadily as American forces pushed forward against an enemy that seemed willing to die in place rather than surrender. The initial assault on Parry Island had breached the Japanese line but had not broken it, and the real test of American determination and Japanese resolve was only just beginning. The morning of the 23rd of February broke across Parry Island with a grey light that brought no relief to the men who had landed the day before. The beach, which had seemed impossibly distant from the transport ships, was now home, a narrow strip of black sand and coral rubble where American Marines dug themselves into shallow positions, aware that the real fight was only beginning. Behind them, the lagoon reflected the movement of supply boats and destroyers anchoring offshore. Ahead lay a maze of Japanese fortifications, concrete pillboxes, buried gun emplacements, trenches disguised by palm fronds and coral blocks, and underground command posts connected by tunnels that honeycombed the island's interior. The Marines knew, from briefings and reconnaissance reports, that Major Masaji Kitano had turned Parry into something resembling a small fortress, not impregnable, but formidable enough that momentum and surprise would count for little now. What would count was discipline, coordination, and the willingness to move forward into prepared defensive fire. The plan was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. American forces would advance south and southeast across the island, using fire and maneuver, and overwhelm Japanese positions one at a time. Company-sized units would move forward under covering fire from machine guns and mortars, while engineers worked to clear obstacles and demolish bunkers with explosives and flamethrowers. Naval gunfire from destroyers standing offshore would continue to rake suspected Japanese positions, though the proximity of American troops to the front lines meant that coordination had to be nearly perfect. The regimental commander understood that haste could be fatal. Pushing too fast risked friendly casualties from supporting fire. Moving too slowly gave the Japanese time to reinforce threatened positions and launch counterattacks. The balance between aggression and caution would define the next 2 days of combat. As dawn broke fully and the coral dust began to rise above the island, forward observer teams with the Marine units called in coordinates for naval gunfire. The destroyers offshore responded with measured precision, their guns firing in volleys that sent shells inland in shallow arcs. The sound was immense and continuous, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very earth beneath the Marines' feet. Watching from forward positions, American soldiers saw Japanese defensive positions erupt in cascades of coral and sand, and occasionally, the brief glimpse of Japanese soldiers rushing to reassess their damaged fortifications or prepare secondary positions. Between the naval gunfire, Marine artillery teams firing from positions near the beach added their own contribution, their medium-caliber guns creating a pattern of explosions that attempted to suppress Japanese machine gun nests identified in the previous day's fighting. The coordination, though imperfect, was effective enough that the Japanese could not simply pour sustained fire across the beach positions without incurring devastating counter-battery fire. Around 0900 hours, the first marine companies began their advance inland. They moved in short rushes, teams of 4 or 5 men sprinting across open ground, while other teams provided covering fire from behind. The moment a position became active, a machine gun stuttering to life, mortar rounds arcing up into the sky, the advancing Marines would drop into the coral rubble and return fire while their supporting elements identified the source and brought fire to bear. The Japanese defenders, though skilled and determined, found themselves unable to maintain continuous fire across all possible avenues of advance. Some bunkers had been damaged extensively by preliminary bombardment and were less effective than their designers had intended. Others, buried deeper or positioned more carefully, remained lethal obstacles that had to be approached with extreme care and assaulted with specialized weapons. This was where flamethrower teams and demolition specialists earned their place at the forefront of combat. The assault on individual bunkers developed a grim pattern that repeated throughout the day. A bunker would be identified by fire from a Japanese machine gun, anti-tank gun, or mortar. Marine riflemen and machine gunners would suppress its firing ports with accurate fire, pinning the defenders down and forcing them to crouch behind their embrasures rather than aim effectively. Combat engineers or flamethrower teams would move forward under covering fire, approaching the bunker from angles where Japanese defenders could not effectively concentrate their weapons. The flamethrower operator would move into position while his assistant and security team watched for Japanese soldiers attempting to abandon the position or launch grenade attacks. When the moment came, the flamethrower would ignite, sending a stream of burning fuel into the bunker's interior. The effect was brutal but necessary. Japanese defenders who survived the fire often emerged choking and disoriented, ready to be finished off by waiting riflemen. Some bunkers, particularly those with multiple entrances or those positioned in defiladed areas where the flamethrower could not achieve proper angle, required demolition charges inserted into firing ports and detonated by hand. Each assault consumed time, ammunition, and sometimes American lives. By midday, American forces had advanced roughly 400 meters inland from the initial beachhead, but the progress had been hard-won. The world of Parry Island, never conducive to rapid advance, became a nightmare of obstacles for attackers. The Japanese had created a layered defensive system, not a single impregnable line, but multiple bands of resistance spaced across the island's width. Each band consisted of multiple bunkers placed to provide mutual supporting fire, making it difficult for American forces to bypass any single position. Underground tunnels connected many of the bunkers, allowing Japanese defenders to move between positions and reinforce threatened sectors. Some tunnels had been bombed and shelled closed during the preliminary bombardment, but others remained open and functional. The Japanese garrison, though taking heavy casualties from naval gunfire and airstrikes, was still capable of fighting with organized resistance. This was not a rout or a rapid breakthrough. This was the grinding business of siege warfare, conducted in miniature on a tropical island. The cost of the advance became apparent as darkness fell on the first full day of inland combat. Marine casualty reports filtered back to the regimental command post, carried by runners and communicated via field telephone to battalion and company commanders. Dead and wounded accumulated in the aid stations established near the beach. Medical corpsmen moved between wounded Marines, applying field dressings, administering morphine, and marking those who could be evacuated to the hospital ships offshore for those who would have to wait for transport. The Japanese were also suffering. Scouts reported seeing scattered bodies in and around destroyed bunkers, observing blood trails leading to sealed positions where wounded defenders had taken shelter. But the Japanese were fighting as if defeat was impossible, as if surrender was not an option. This was not fanaticism exactly, though that word would be used by observers. Rather, it was the logical consequence of military code and the belief that death in defense of the emperor was the only honorable outcome. As the 24th of February dawned, American forces resumed their advance with renewed intensity. The preliminary bombardment by naval gunfire continued with increased frequency. The commanders offshore wanted to suppress Japanese artillery and mortar positions before they could inflict significant damage on the advancing Marines. Reconnaissance flights had identified additional Japanese gun positions overnight, and destroyers marked time offshore, ready to deliver fire on coordinates provided by forward observers. The Marine companies pressed forward again, moving through terrain that was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. The preliminary bombing and shelling had turned much of Parry into a world of torn palms, shattered coral blocks, and debris from destroyed fortifications. Foxholes and entrenchments added to the complexity, and soldiers moving through this ground had to watch constantly for concealed Japanese positions, anti-tank obstacles, and the bodies of the dead, both American and Japanese, that marked the path of previous advances. Around 0800 hours on the 24th, Japanese forces launched a coordinated counterattack against the American beachhead and forward positions. The assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting that Kitano and his staff had maintained command and control despite the heavy bombardment and losses of the previous day. Japanese soldiers emerged from bunkers and covered positions with a mix of organized precision and desperate intensity. Some groups formed into rough squads and attempted to overrun Marine positions near the beach, using suppressive fire and grenades to dislodge American defenders. Other Japanese defenders surged eastward and northward, attempting to retake ground lost during the morning's advance. The Marine defenders, though outnumbered in isolated sectors, had prepared defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gunners waited until the attacking Japanese were in the open before launching sustained fire that broke formations and sent attackers sprawling across the coral ground. Mortar teams fired from prepared positions near the beach, their rounds walking up and down the paths of the Japanese assault, creating cascades of casualties. The counterattack was repulsed within roughly 90 minutes, though not without cost to the defenders. American casualty figures climbed again as Japanese machine gunners and snipers found targets among the Marine defenders. Casualties were evacuated where possible, left in place when movement was impossible due to intense sniper fire or the proximity of Japanese positions. The repulse of the Japanese assault demonstrated something important to the American commanders. The Japanese garrison was increasingly desperate, throwing away soldiers in attacks that had little chance of succeeding, rather than simply conducting defensive battles in their prepared fortifications. This shift in tactics, though costly for the Americans in the short term, suggested that Japanese leadership was beginning to recognize the hopelessness of their position. When commanders resort to human wave attacks, they have often concluded that positional defense alone will not stem the tide. The afternoon and evening of the 24th saw continued American advance with mounting Japanese desperation. Each bunker that fell left gaps in the Japanese defensive line, forcing remaining defenders to adjust their positions and cover increasingly larger sectors with their limited firepower. Company commanders began to report that their men were encountering pockets of Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender, a rare occurrence in the Pacific War, suggesting that some defenders were beginning to recognize that continued resistance was pointless. Others continued to fight to the death, launching grenade attacks from their bunkers or emerging to charge American positions in what amounted to suicidal assaults. The distinction between soldiers willing to surrender and those committed to fighting to the end began to emerge as a pattern that would shape the final days of the campaign. American commanders had to contend with the practical difficulty of accepting surrender while simultaneously maintaining security and continuing to push forward. As night fell on the 24th, American forces held roughly half of Parry Island, having advanced in a broad band across the middle portion of the atoll. The Japanese held the southern portions of the island, where Kitano and his command staff still maintained organized resistance. The rate of advance had slowed compared to the preliminary estimates, but American commanders recognized that they were making progress against prepared defenses and that Japanese capacity to organize meaningful resistance was visibly declining. The casualties on both sides had been substantial, but the American forces could be reinforced and resupplied through the ships offshore. The Japanese garrison, cut off from outside support and diminishing in numbers with each hour of combat, had no such capability. The mathematics of the battle were increasingly unfavorable to the Japanese, and as the 25th of February approached, it was becoming clear that the question was not whether Parry would fall, but how many more days it would take and what the final cost would be to both sides. In the final days of February 1944, the island of Parry existed in a state of collapse that resembled nothing so much as a slow-burning apocalypse. The American forces pressing inland had reduced what was once a organized garrison into scattered clusters of desperate men, separated from one another by devastated terrain and the relentless advance of superior firepower. Major Masaji Kitano, the commander whose reputation had been built on the promise of an impregnable atoll, now occupied an underground headquarters from which he could hear the sounds of his fortress crumbling around him. The bombardment had not ceased. In fact, it had evolved into something more methodical and suffocating, a constant reminder that the Americans controlled the skies, the waters, and increasingly, the ground beneath Japanese feet. What remained of his once formidable garrison, numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, scattered across fortified positions that were rapidly being overrun or isolated. Kitano faced a command decision that would define not only the final hours of Eniwetok's defense, but also his own place in the history of his nation. He could contemplate surrender, an option that existed in the military lexicon, but carried a weight in Japanese culture that made it nearly impossible to accept. The Japanese soldier of 1944 had been raised in a martial tradition that viewed surrender as a form of ultimate shame, a betrayal of the emperor, and an abandonment of honor that would render a man worse than dead in the eyes of his comrades and countrymen. This was not mere propaganda, though propaganda surely reinforced it. The code of the warrior, known as Bushido, had been woven into the very fabric of Japanese military indoctrination over decades, making the concept of laying down arms and facing capture something that many Japanese soldiers saw as spiritually impossible. Stories circulated among the garrison, some true, some exaggerated, some entirely invented, about what awaited Japanese prisoners in American hands. These narratives, whether factual or not, had the practical effect of making surrender seem less like a rational military choice and more like a choice between death in combat and a worse death in captivity. Kitano himself had received communications from higher command that left no ambiguity about expectations. The message was clear: hold until the last man falls. There was no authorization for negotiation, no instruction to preserve the lives of the garrison by withdrawing or surrendering. Instead, Tokyo's directives emphasized that every hour of resistance delayed the American advance, that every Japanese soldier who fought to the death inflicted casualties on the enemy, and that this sacrifice served the greater cause of the war effort. In this context, Kitano's options were not really options at all. He could die fighting, or he could die refusing to fight. But surrender was not a path that led anywhere except dishonor. The Japanese soldiers still alive on Parry Island fell into different categories as the battle entered its final phase. Some were young conscripts, teenagers and men in their early 20s, who had been rushed to Eniwetok as replacements only weeks before the American assault began. Others were more seasoned soldiers, who had seen combat in other theaters and understood the mechanics of warfare in a way that the conscripts could not. A smaller number were non-commissioned officers and junior officers who had received some education in leadership, though what leadership meant in a situation where defeat was certain and escape was impossible remained a profound and troubling question. The garrison included combat engineers, anti-aircraft gunners, artillerymen, and sailors from the naval detachment that had been stationed at the atoll. The Americans had by now eliminated or captured most of the senior officers, meaning that command and control had devolved to whoever happened to be in proximity to a group of men and possessed the will to continue giving orders. These pockets of resistance were not coordinated by any overall strategic plan. Instead, they operated according to a basic logic: occupy the nearest defensible position, make the Americans pay for every meter of ground they advance, and continue fighting until death became inevitable. Some of these positions were concrete bunkers with multiple firing ports and thick walls capable of withstanding artillery fire. Others were hastily prepared trenches, shell craters turned into fighting positions, or simply stands of rubble that offered some concealment and fields of fire toward the advancing Americans. The American advance had by necessity become a grinding, methodical affair, not because the Japanese were mounting coordinated counterattacks. They largely lacked the organization and firepower for that, but because each strongpoint had to be reduced individually, often at great cost. As American forces pressed deeper into Parry's interior, they encountered bands of Japanese defenders who had no possibility of retreat and no intention of surrendering. These encounters took the form of sudden firefights, ambushes from concealed positions, and suicidal charges that seemed to violate every principle of military logic, but which actually served a psychological purpose both for the soldiers mounting them and for those who heard about them afterward. The concept of a charge was often understood in the Western military tradition as an organized assault by a formed unit with a reasonable expectation of breaking through a defensive line. What occurred on Parry Island in late February was something different. It was the action of cornered men who had decided that death in motion was preferable to death crouching in a bunker, and there was a dignity in that choice, terrible and pointless as it appeared to the Americans who had to kill them. These attacks came during darkness primarily, when Japanese soldiers felt slightly less exposed to American firepower and slightly more capable of surprising their enemies. They would emerge from their positions and rush forward with bayonets fixed, sometimes shouting, sometimes silent, knowing with a clarity born of desperation that they were almost surely walking toward their own deaths, but unable or unwilling to accept the alternative. The night of February 24th represented one of the final coordinated efforts that Major Kitano's fragmenting command attempted to organize. Japanese defenders launched what amounted to a counterattack against American positions near the center of the island, an effort that historians would later describe as desperate, but which the men participating in it experienced as a final opportunity to strike back, to matter in the conflict, to contribute something meaningful to their nation's struggle. The attack involved perhaps 150 men, organized into groups that were supposed to assault American positions simultaneously and overwhelm them through sheer violence. The plan, insofar as it existed, relied on surprise and speed, the assumption being that American troops might be less alert during night hours, and that a sudden violent assault could rupture their lines enough to create some opportunity for withdrawal or regrouping. The attack achieved initial surprise in some sectors. Japanese soldiers emerged from darkness and struck American defensive positions with grenades, rifle fire, and bayonets. For perhaps 30 minutes, the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain. American soldiers awoke to violence in their perimeter and had to fight with rifles, grenades, and machine guns to drive off the assaulting waves. But what the Japanese forces lacked was the ability to sustain momentum. The Americans, despite being initially surprised, recovered quickly and brought overwhelming firepower to bear. Flares illuminated the landscape, turning night into harsh artificial day. Machine guns found targets. Artillery support arrived within minutes. The Japanese counterattack, which had seemed dangerous in its opening moments, collapsed into a slaughter as the American defenders methodically eliminated the attacking forces. In the aftermath of that failed counterattack, the remaining Japanese garrison effectively ceased to exist as an organized military force. What persisted were scattered clusters of survivors, many of them wounded, most of them cut off from any possibility of coordinated action. Some fought from prepared positions until they were killed or buried under American bombardment. Others, isolated and convinced that continued resistance was futile, chose death in various forms. Some killed themselves rather than surrender, an act that was not so much an expression of military discipline as it was a surrender to despair. Others simply ceased to resist when American soldiers entered their positions, having reached the limit of their capacity or willingness to continue fighting. A handful of Japanese soldiers, though the exact number remains uncertain, actually did surrender and allow themselves to be taken prisoner. Men who, whether through injury, shock, or a personal decision to defy the expectations of their culture, chose survival over the mythology of honorable death. The Americans, for their part, were by now thoroughly exhausted. They had been fighting continuously for several days, moving over terrain that was essentially a maze of craters and shattered fortifications, never knowing when the next shot would come or from which direction. They had casualties of their own, men killed and wounded in the fighting, and their medical personnel were working constantly to keep pace with the wounded requiring treatment. Major Kitano's own final hours remain incompletely documented, preserved only in fragmentary accounts and inference from what the Americans knew about the state of the battlefield. He had never publicly discussed surrender and never showed any inclination toward it. Unlike some commanders who managed to slip away from surrounded positions and escape to fight elsewhere, Kitano appears to have remained on Parry Island as his command disintegrated. Some accounts suggest he was killed in combat, struck down by American fire as he moved between defensive positions. Others indicate he may have been among the Japanese officers found dead in an underground bunker, surrounded by the physical detritus of a headquarters that had become a tomb. The exact circumstances of his death would likely never be completely known, obscured by the chaos of the final days of fighting and the simple fact that the Americans were not particularly concerned with documenting the fate of individual Japanese officers. What was clear was that he died as the commander of a defeated garrison, having chosen resistance over retreat and having maintained that choice to the end. Whether this constituted honor or waste, courage or stubbornness, depended largely on the perspective from which one viewed it. The Japanese soldiers who survived the final days of fighting on Parry Island, whether they had surrendered to American forces or had somehow avoided capture in the chaos, faced an uncertain future. Those who had allowed themselves to be taken prisoner faced the propaganda value they represented. Their survival seemed to contradict the narratives that Tokyo and field commanders had promoted about the preference for death. The Japanese military establishment's response to prisoners was complex and often harsh, as captured soldiers were sometimes viewed with suspicion or contempt. The Americans, for their part, had made enormous efforts to protect prisoners and gather intelligence from them, motivated both by military necessity and by the simple fact that many American soldiers rejected the notion that all Japanese should be killed without mercy. But the existence of prisoners did nothing to change the fundamental reality of Parry Island. The Japanese garrison was gone. Its fortifications were destroyed or captured. Its commander was dead. Its supplies were exhausted or captured. The strategic position that Tokyo had believed to be impregnable had fallen to American forces in less than 2 weeks of fighting, and while that fortnight had cost the Americans casualties and effort, it had cost the Japanese the complete destruction of an entire garrison. The final Japanese positions on Parry Island represented the last moments of coordinated defense in the atoll. After February 26th, organized Japanese military activity on Parry effectively ceased, though American forces would continue to clear out small pockets of resistance and isolated soldiers for several more days. The island that had been fortified with such labor and investment of resources, defended with such determination, was now an American possession. The cost had been significant for both sides, though measured in different ways. For the Japanese, it meant the loss of a major defensive position and the destruction of an entire garrison that could not be replaced. For the Americans, it meant that they had successfully broken Japan's second line of defense and had proven that the island-hopping strategy could work even against heavily fortified positions. The lessons learned from Eniwetok would inform the approach to future operations, and the tactical improvements and strategic adjustments would accelerate the American advance across the Pacific. But on Parry Island in late February 1944, what stood out most was the simple fact of finality. The Japanese resistance that had seemed so formidable in the pre-invasion planning documents, in the intelligence reports, in the minds of the American soldiers approaching the beaches, had been broken. The final charges, the final refusals to surrender, the final moments of defiance. These did not change the outcome, but they did define the character of the defense, and ensured that what was lost in battle rather than abandoned without a fight. The psychological dimensions of this final phase of combat extended beyond the soldiers themselves. News of the fall of Eniwetok eventually reached Tokyo, transmitted through military channels and understood by the civilian and military leadership as another breach in the defensive perimeter that was supposed to keep the Americans away from the Japanese homeland. The loss of Major Kitano and his garrison suggested that even well-prepared positions, even positions where the defenders had chosen death over surrender, could not stop the American advance. This realization had consequences for how future defenses were planned and how remaining garrisons were briefed about what to expect. The mythology of certain defensive victory became harder to sustain after Eniwetok. Instead, the emphasis shifted toward attrition, the hope that each island battle would inflict sufficient casualties on the Americans to eventually make further advances too costly to contemplate. But that strategy required accepting the loss of islands, the loss of garrisons, the loss of territory, and measuring success not by holding ground, but by the damage inflicted on the enemy. For soldiers in the field, like those on Parry Island, this shift meant that their sacrifice was reframed from a battle to be won into a price to be paid, a distinction that mattered little to the men dying, but which carried profound implications for how the war itself would unfold in the months ahead. In the darkness before dawn on February 25, 1944, The remains of Major Masaji Kitano's garrison held territory measuring less than half a square mile. What had once seemed an impregnable fortress had contracted to scattered strongpoints scattered across the northern and central portions of Parry Island, each one connected by a network of tunnels and blast trenches that had become tombs rather than sanctuaries. The American advance had been methodical and ruthless, grinding forward through fire and rubble, converting the landscape itself into an instrument of destruction. Behind the American lines, medical stations overflowed with wounded men, their evacuation already beginning to clogged transports anchored in the lagoon. The supply dumps grew larger by the hour, as American logisticians ensured that nothing would stop the final push toward complete conquest of the atoll. Yet for all the American advantages, the Japanese soldiers dug in across Parry remained extraordinarily dangerous, their discipline unbroken despite the hopelessness of their situation. The morning of February 25th brought renewed artillery preparation, though the bombardment now focused with surgical precision on identified Japanese positions rather than the generalized softening that had preceded the initial landings. American spotters, perched on rubble and in forward observation posts, directed fire with an intimacy born from 3 days of continuous combat. They knew where every machine gun nest sat, where the mortar sections had dug in, where the ammunition supplies lay hidden beneath layers of coral and concrete. The shells came with the regularity of a metronome, one detonation following another in waves that left the ground quaking and the air thick with dust and the acrid smell of explosive powder. Japanese soldiers crouched in their bunkers with nothing to do but endure, their ammunition carefully rationed, their food supplies nearly exhausted, their water running low. Some men had stopped speaking, their psychological reserves spent by days of continuous shelling and assault. Others maintained desperate hope that reinforcements might somehow pierce the American naval cordon, despite the knowledge that no such relief could possibly arrive. As the artillery lifted and American forces prepared for the assault, Japanese officers made their final decisions about how to meet the end. The regimental commander had already authorized soldiers to fight to the last man, articulating in careful language what every enlisted man already understood. Surrender was not an option. Honor demanded resistance, and resistance meant death. Some officers had already committed suicide according to military tradition, leaving their subordinates without higher authority to make decisions. Major Kitano himself remained in a command bunker, his communications gradually failing as American shells destroyed telephone lines and radio equipment throughout the atoll. He could no longer coordinate his scattered forces, could no longer receive reports from distant strongpoints, could no longer order tactical withdrawals. His command had become merely symbolic, yet the symbol itself retained power over men conditioned since childhood to obey their military superiors without question. The assault resumed at mid-morning, with Marines and soldiers advancing in small groups, using the island's own rubble as cover, methodically clearing bunkers with flamethrowers and grenades. The defenders fired back with whatever weapons they still possessed, but the rate of fire had dropped dramatically as ammunition grew scarce and personnel losses accumulated. American casualties continued, though at a decreasing pace as the defenders were reduced from hundreds to dozens. Each bunker represented a miniature battle, a desperate struggle in the suffocating heat, surrounded by bodies and the dust of pulverized coral and concrete. The Americans had learned through 3 days of combat which approaches worked, how to minimize exposure, how to suppress enemy fire before making final rushes. They moved with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed these motions repeatedly against determined resistance. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, fought according to doctrines that emphasized honor and sacrifice but offered no tactical flexibility against an enemy that had achieved complete air and naval superiority. By afternoon on February 25th, American forces had compressed the remaining Japanese positions into a roughly circular perimeter in the center of Parry Island, an area no more than 200 yards across. The pocket was surrounded, its defenders cut off from any hope of resupply or evacuation. Surrender demands were broadcast through megaphones in both English and Japanese, appealing to the defenders' sense of military dignity and suggesting that death accomplished nothing. The broadcasts were met with silence and occasional bursts of machine gun fire directed toward the loudspeakers. American commanders had learned not to expect surrender in such situations, not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or sense, but because their culture and military training had constructed surrender as a form of shame worse than death. The defenders in this final pocket understood with absolute clarity that the next sunrise, if they survived to see it, would likely bring the final assault. They spent the night in prayer or silence, each man confronting his own mortality in the context of obligations that transcended personal survival. The final assault came on the morning of February 26, with methodical ferocity that reflected American confidence in victory. Artillery and aircraft had been called off to avoid wasting ammunition on positions that were already surrounded and could not escape. The assault was carried out by riflemen and engineers, supported by machine guns and mortars positioned on the surrounding high ground. The noise of combat echoed across the lagoon, attracting crowds of soldiers from other units who had completed their own local operations. Some came to witness the end, others hoping to be in position to exploit any breakthrough in the Japanese position, a few motivated by something darker, a desire for vengeance after days of fighting men who had shown no mercy and asked for none. The bunkers were entered individually, each one a localized nightmare of darkness and concrete and the proximity of armed enemies. Grenades were thrown into entrances, flamethrowers poured burning fuel into openings. Men fought with bayonets and entrenching tools when enemy soldiers were encountered in close quarters. The sounds of combat gradually diminished as the afternoon progressed, not because fighting ceased, but because there were simply fewer defenders left alive to maintain it. By late afternoon on February 26th, the killing stopped, though the dying continued for hours afterward as medics worked to save men wounded in the final assault, and as the Japanese realized that all organized resistance had in fact ended. The American flag was raised over the island, a symbolic gesture without military significance but profound meaning for the soldiers who had fought 3 days and 4 nights to achieve it. Engineers moved in immediately, beginning the vast work of cataloging captured equipment, clearing the beaches of mines and obstacles, and beginning the construction of airfield facilities that would support the next phase of the Pacific Campaign. The beaches, which had been obstacles to be overcome, became orderly depots filled with supplies and vehicles. The bunkers, which had been seats of deadly resistance, became evidence of Japanese preparation and American determination. Bodies, American and Japanese, were collected and processed with grim efficiency, placed in body bags or wrapped in whatever materials were available. The death toll told the story in numbers: 24 Americans killed and 95 wounded in the assault on Parry Island, each casualty representing a family back home that would receive a telegram bringing sorrow into ordinary American lives. The scale of Japanese casualties was incomparably greater, the destruction more absolute. Of the approximately 3,000 soldiers and laborers who had occupied Eniwetok Atoll when the Americans arrived, nearly all were dead. Parry Island alone had been garrisoned by roughly 300 soldiers under Major Kitano's direct command, and the vast majority had chosen or been forced to fight to their deaths rather than surrender. The bodies lay in the bunkers, in the trenches, scattered across the island's surface, in the shallow lagoon where some had fled seeking escape. American burial details worked methodically through the debris, recording positions and attempting to treat the bodies with whatever dignity seemed appropriate to soldiers hardened by days of combat. The prisoners taken alive numbered fewer than 50 across the entire atoll, men too severely wounded to resist capture, or who had been separated from their units when resistance collapsed. The contrast between Japanese losses and American casualties spoke to the colossal imbalance in military power that had developed by February 1944, the chasm between an industrial powerhouse that could absorb losses and replace equipment, and an island nation whose losses were irreplaceable. Major Kitano was found dead in his command bunker late on February 26, surrounded by his personal staff and the remnants of his communication equipment. He had chosen death over captivity, the final act of a commander who had fulfilled his orders to the end and accepted the consequences. His death symbolized the absolute collapse of Japanese resistance on Eniwetok, the end of any military organization capable of coordinated response. With him died the chain of command that had made Eniwetok a fortress worthy of the name. The remaining Japanese scattered across smaller islands of the atoll would be mopped up over the following days, eliminated piecemeal as they attempted to resist from increasingly isolated positions. But the main conquest was accomplished. The atoll that Japan had believed impregnable had fallen in under a week of intensive combat. The defensive strategy that Tokyo had believed would slow the American advance had been overcome by coordinated naval power, air superiority, and the ruthless application of infantry tactics refined through months of island warfare. The systematic elimination of the last pockets of resistance continued through February and into early March, though the fighting was gradually reduced to rear area security operations rather than major tactical engagements. Engineers and sailors, sometimes accompanied by armed guards, moved across the smaller islands of the atoll, encountering small groups of Japanese soldiers and laborers who fought with the desperation of men with nowhere left to retreat. Some Japanese chose to commit suicide rather than be captured, jumping from coral cliffs or throwing themselves on grenades. Others, encountering overwhelming American numbers and firepower, finally surrendered, coming out of hiding with their hands raised, their eyes avoiding contact with their captors. The work of clearing unexploded ordnance continued for weeks, mine-clearing teams moving systematically across beaches and interior positions, removing obstacles that Japanese planners had installed to prevent exactly the kind of landing that had just occurred. The naval guns that had dominated the landscape, captured intact, were removed or destroyed to prevent any possibility of Japanese reoccupation. The bunkers were catalogued, photographed, and in many cases demolished to ensure they could not be returned to service against the Americans. The strategic implications of Parry's fall extended far beyond the atoll itself, rippling through Japanese military councils and American command posts in roughly equal measure of despair and elation. For Japan, the loss of Eniwetok represented the definitive breakthrough of the outer defensive perimeter that military planners had considered essential to the protection of the homeland. The island-hopping strategy that American theorists had developed and that commanders like Admiral Spruance had executed with increasing mastery had proven devastatingly effective against a nation that could not replace the soldiers lost or the strategic territory surrendered. The fallback positions at Saipan and Guam, scheduled to be invaded within weeks, would be assaulted by an enemy that had now demonstrated complete mastery of amphibious warfare and enjoyed unchallenged superiority in air and naval power. For America, the victory confirmed that the strategy was working,